Number 13 by M.R. James. Among the towns of Jutland, Viborg justly holds a high place. It is the seat of a bishopric. It has a handsome but almost entirely new cathedral, a charming garden, a lake of great beauty, and many storks. Near it is Hald, accounted one of the prettiest things in Denmark, and hard by is Finderup, where Marsk Stig murdered King Eric Glipping on St. Cecilia's Day in the year 1286. 56 blows of square-headed iron maces were traced on Eric's skull when his tomb was opened in the 17th century. But I am not writing a guidebook. There are good hotels in Viborg. Preisler's and the Phoenix are all that can be desired. But my cousin, whose experiences I have to tell you now, went to the Golden Lion the first time that he visited Viborg. He has not been there since, and the following pages will perhaps explain the reason of his abstention. The Golden Lion is one of the very few houses in the town that were not destroyed in the Great Fire of 1726, which practically demolished the cathedral, the Sønekirke, and the Raadhuis, and so much else that was old and interesting. It is a great red brick house, that is, the front is of brick with corby steps on the gables and a text over the door, but the courtyard into which the omnibus drives is of black and white cagework in wood and plaster. The sun was declining in the heavens when my cousin walked up to the door, and the light smote full upon the imposing facade of the house. He was delighted with the old-fashioned aspect of the place, and promised himself a thoroughly satisfactory and amusing stay in an inn so typical of old Jutland. It was not business in the ordinary sense of the word that had brought Mr. Anderson to Viborg. He was engaged upon some researches into the church history of Denmark, and it had come to his knowledge that in the Rigsarvik of Viborg there were papers, saved from the fire, relating to the last days of Roman Catholicism in the country. He proposed, therefore, to spend a considerable time, perhaps so much as a fortnight or 3 weeks, in examining and copying these, and he hoped that the Golden Lion would be able to give him a room of sufficient size to serve alike as a bedroom and a study. His wishes were explained to the landlord, and after a certain amount of thought, the latter suggested that perhaps it might be the best way for the gentleman to look at 1 or 2 of the larger rooms and pick one for himself. It seemed a good idea. The top floor was soon rejected as entailing too much getting upstairs after a day's work. The second floor contained no room of exactly the dimensions required, but on the first floor there was a choice of 2 or 3 rooms which would, so far as size went, suit admirably. The landlord was strongly in favour of number 17, but Mr. Anderson pointed out that its windows commanded only the blank wall of the next house, and that it would be very dark in the afternoon. Either number 12 or number 14 would be better, for both of them looked on the street, and the bright evening light, and the pretty view would more than compensate him for the additional amount of noise. Eventually, number 12 was selected. Like its neighbours, it had 3 windows, all on one side of the room. It was fairly high and unusually long. There was, of course, no fireplace, but the stove was handsome and rather old, a cast-iron erection on the side of which was a representation of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, and the inscription, 1 Bogmose Cap 22 above. Nothing else in the room was remarkable. The only interesting picture was an old coloured print of the town, date about 1820. Supper time was approaching, but when Anderson, refreshed by the ordinary ablutions, descended the staircase, there were still a few minutes before the bell rang. He devoted them to examining the list of his fellow lodgers. As is usual in Denmark, their names were displayed on a large blackboard, divided into columns and lines, the numbers of the rooms being painted in at the beginning of each line. The list was not exciting. There was an advocate, or sagfører, a German, and some bagmen from Copenhagen. The one and only point which suggested any food for thought was the absence of any number 13 from the tale of the rooms, and even this was a thing which Anderson had already noticed half a dozen times in his experience of Danish hotels. He couldn't help wondering whether the objection to that particular number common as it is, was so widespread and so strong as to make it difficult to let a room so ticketed, and he resolved to ask the landlord if he and his colleagues in the profession had actually met with many clients who refused to be accommodated in the 13th room. He had nothing to tell me. I'm giving the story as I heard it from him, about what passed at supper and the evening, which was spent in unpacking and arranging his clothes, books and papers, was not more eventful. Towards 11 o'clock, he resolved to go to bed. But with him, as with a good many other people nowadays, an almost necessary preliminary to bed, if he meant to sleep, was the reading of a few pages of print. And he now remembered that the particular book which he had been reading in the train, and which alone would satisfy him at the present moment, was in the pocket of his greatcoat, then hanging on a peg outside the dining room. To run down and secure it was the work of a moment, and as the passages were by no means dark, it was not difficult for him to find his way back to his own door. So at least he thought. But when he arrived there and turned the handle, the door entirely refused to open, and he caught the sound of a hasty movement towards it from within. He had tried the wrong door, of course. Was his own room to the right or to the left? He glanced at the number. It was 13. His room would be on the left, and so it was. And not before he had been in bed for some minutes, had read his wonted 3 or 4 pages of his book, blown out his light and turned over to go to sleep, did it occur to him that whereas on the blackboard of the hotel there had been no number 13, there was undoubtedly a room numbered 13 in the hotel. He felt rather sorry he hadn't chosen it for his own. Perhaps he might have done the landlord a little service by occupying it, and given him the chance of saying that a well-born English gentleman had lived in it for 3 weeks, and liked it very much, but probably it was used as a servant's room or something of the kind. After all, it was most likely not so large or good a room as his own, and he looked drowsily about the room, which was fairly perceptible in the half-light from the street lamp. It was a curious effect, he thought. Rooms usually look larger in the dim light than a full one, but this seemed to have contracted in length and grown proportionately higher. Well, sleep was more important than these vague ruminations, and to sleep he went. On the day after his arrival, Andersen attacked the Rigsarvik of Viborg. He was, as one might expect in Denmark, kindly received, and access to all that he wished to see was made as easy for him as possible. The documents laid before him were far more numerous and interesting than he had at all anticipated. Besides official papers, there was a large bundle of correspondence relating to Bishop Jürgen Fries, the last Roman Catholic who held the see, and in these there cropped up many amusing and what are called intimate details of private life and individual character. There was much talk of a house owned by the bishop, but not inhabited by him, in the town. Its tenant was apparently somewhat of a scandal and a stumbling block to the reforming party. He was a disgrace, they wrote, to the city. He practiced the secret and wicked arts, and had sold his soul to the enemy. It was of a piece with the gross corruption and superstition of the Babylonish church that such a viper and blood-sucking troldmand should be patronized and harbored by the bishop. The bishop met these reproaches boldly. He protested his own abhorrence of all such things as secret arts, and required his antagonists to bring the matter before the proper court, of course, the spiritual court, and sift it to the bottom. No one could be more ready and willing than himself to condemn Magister Nicholas Franken if the evidence showed him to have been guilty of any of the crimes informally alleged against him. Andersen had not time to do more than glance at the next letter of the Protestant leader Erasmus Nielsen before the record office was closed for the day, but he gathered its general tenor, which was to the effect that Christian men were now no longer bound by the decisions of the bishops of Rome, and that the bishop's court was not and could not be a fit or competent tribunal to judge so grave and weighty a cause. On leaving the office, Mr. Andersen was accompanied by the old gentleman who presided over it, and as they walked, the conversation very naturally turned to the papers of which I have just been speaking. Herr Scavenius, the archivist of Viborg, though very well informed as to the general run of the documents under his charge, was not a specialist in those of the Reformation period. He was much interested in what Andersen had to tell him about them. He looked forward with great pleasure, he said, to seeing the publication in which Mr. Andersen spoke of embodying their contents. This house of the Bishop Fries, he added, it is a great puzzle to me where it could have stood. I have studied carefully the topography of old Viborg, but it is most unlucky of the old terrier of the bishop's property, which was made in 1560, and of which we have the greatest part in the archive. Just the piece which had the list of the town property is missing. Never mind. Perhaps I shall some day succeed to find him. After taking some exercise, I forget exactly how or where, Andersen went back to the Golden Lion, his supper, his game of patience, and his bed. On the way to his room, it occurred to him that he had forgotten to talk to the landlord about the omission of number 13 from the hotel, and also that he might as well make sure that number 13 did actually exist before he made any reference to the matter. The decision was not difficult to arrive at. There was the door, with its number as plain as could be, and work of some kind was evidently going on inside it, for as he neared the door, he could hear footsteps and voices, or a voice, within. During the few seconds in which he halted to make sure of the number, the footsteps ceased, seemingly very near the door, and he was a little startled at hearing a quick hissing breathing, as of a person in strong excitement. He went on to his own room, and again he was surprised to find how much smaller it seemed now than it had when he selected it. It was a slight disappointment, but only slight. If he found it really not large enough, he could very easily shift to another. In the meantime, he wanted something. As far as I remember, it was a pocket handkerchief out of his portmanteau, which had been placed by the porter on a very inadequate trestle or stool against the wall at the farthest end of the room from his bed. Here was a very curious thing. The portmanteau was not to be seen. It had been moved by officious servants. Doubtless the contents had been put in the wardrobe. No, none of them were there. This was vexatious. The idea of a theft he dismissed at once. Such things rarely happened in Denmark. But some piece of stupidity had certainly been performed, which is not so uncommon, and the stupige must be severely spoken to. Whatever it was that he wanted, it was not so necessary to his comfort that he could not wait till the morning for it, and he therefore settled not to ring the bell and disturb the servants. He went to the window, the right-hand window it was, and looked out on the quiet street. There was a tall building opposite with large spaces of dead wall, no passers-by, a dark night, and very little to be seen of any kind. The light was behind him, and he could see his own shadow clearly cast on the wall opposite. Also, the shadow of a bearded man in number 11 on the left, who passed to and fro in shirt-sleeves once or twice, and was seen first brushing his hair, and later on in a nightgown. Also, the shadow of the occupant of number 13 on the right. This might be more interesting. Number 13 was, like himself, leaning on his elbows on the windowsill looking out into the street. He seemed to be a tall, thin man, or was it by any chance a woman? At least it was someone who covered his or her head with some kind of drapery before going to bed, and, he thought, must be possessed of a red lampshade, and the lamp must be flickering very much. There was a distinct playing up and down of a dull red light on the opposite wall. He craned out a little to see if he could make any more of the figure, but beyond a fold of some light, perhaps white material on the windowsill, he could see nothing. Now came a distant step in the street, and its approach seemed to recall number 13 to a sense of his exposed position. Very swiftly and suddenly, he swept aside from the window, and his red light went out. Andersen, who had been smoking a cigarette, laid the end of it on the windowsill and went to bed. Next morning he was woken by the stupige with hot water, etc. He roused himself, and after thinking out the correct Danish words, said as distinctly as he could, "You must not move my portmanteau. Where is it?" As is not uncommon, the maid laughed. and went away without making any distinct answer. Anderson, rather irritated, sat up in bed, intending to call her back, but he remained sitting up, staring straight in front of him. There was his portmanteau on its trestle, exactly where he had seen the porter put it when he first arrived. This was a rude shock for a man who prided himself on his accuracy of observation. How could it possibly have escaped him the night before? He did not pretend to understand. At any rate, there it was now. The daylight showed more than a portmanteau. It let the true proportions of the room with its 3 windows appear, and satisfied its tenant that his choice, after all, had not been a bad one. When he was almost dressed, he walked to the middle one of the 3 windows to look out at the weather. Another shock awaited him. Strangely unobservant he must have been last night. He could have sworn 10 times over that he had been smoking at the right-hand window the last thing before he went to bed, and here was his cigarette end on the sill of the middle window. He started to go down to breakfast, rather late, but number 13 was later. Here were his boots outside his door, a gentleman's boots. So then, number 13 was a man, not a woman. Just then he caught sight of the number on the door. It was 14. He thought he must have passed number 13 without noticing it. 3 stupid mistakes in 12 hours were too much for a methodical, accurate-minded man, so he turned back to make sure. The next number to 14 was number 12, his own room. There was no number 13 at all. After some minutes devoted to a careful consideration of everything he had had to eat and drink during the last 24 hours, Anderson decided to give the question up. If his sight or his brain were giving way, he would have plenty of opportunities for ascertaining that fact. If not, then he was evidently being treated to a very interesting experience. In either case, the development of events would certainly be worth watching. During the day, he continued his examination of the episcopal correspondence, which I have already summarized. To his disappointment, it was incomplete. Only one other letter could be found which referred to the affair of Magister Nicholas Franken. It was from the Bishop Jürgen Fries to Rasmus Nielsen. He said, "Although we are not in the least degree inclined to assent to your judgment concerning our court, and shall be prepared, if need be, to withstand you to the uttermost in that behalf, yet, forasmuch as our trusty and well-beloved Magister Nicholas Franken, against whom you have dared to allege certain false and malicious charges, hath been suddenly removed from among us, it is apparent that the question for this time falls. But forasmuch as you further allege that the Apostle and Evangelist St. John in his heavenly apocalypse describes the Holy Roman Church under the guise and symbol of the Scarlet Woman, be it known to you," etc. Search as he might, Anderson could find no sequel to this letter, nor any clue to the cause or manner of the removal of the casus belli. He could only suppose that Franken had died suddenly. And as there were only 2 days between the date of Nielsen's last letter, when Franken was evidently still in being, and that of the bishop's letter, the death must have been completely unexpected. In the afternoon he paid a short visit to Hald and took his tea at Bakalund, nor could he notice, though he was in a somewhat nervous frame of mind, that there was any indication of such a failure of eye or brain as his experiences of the morning had led him to fear. At supper, he found himself next to the landlord. What, he asked him, after some indifferent conversation, is the reason why in most of the hotels one visits in this country, the number 13 is left out of the list of rooms? I see you have none here." The landlord seemed amused. "To think that you should have noticed a thing like that. I've thought about it once or twice myself, to tell the truth. An educated man, I've said, has no business with these superstitious notions. I was brought up myself here in the high school of Viborg, and our old master was always a man to set his face against anything of that kind. He's been dead now this many years. A fine, upstanding man he was, and ready with his hands as well as his head. I recollect us boys on a snowy day." Here he plunged into reminiscence. "Then you don't think there is any particular objection to having a number 13, said Anderson. "Ah, to be sure. Well, you understand, I was brought up to the business by my poor old father. He kept a hotel in Aarhus first, and then, when we were born, he moved to Viborg here, which was his native place, and had the Phoenix here until he died. That was in 1876. Then I started business in Silkeborg, and only the year before last I moved into this house. Then followed more details as to the state of the house and business when first taken over. And when you came here, was there a number 13? No, I was going to tell you about that. You see, in a place like this, the commercial class, the travellers, are what we have to provide for in general. And put them in number 13? Why, they'd sooner sleep in the street or sooner. As far as I'm concerned myself, it wouldn't make a penny difference to me what the number of my room was, and so I've often said to them, but they stick to it that it brings them bad luck. Quantities of stories they have among them of men that have slept in a number 13 and never been the same again, or lost their best customers, or one thing and another, said the landlord, after searching for a more graphic phrase. Then, what do you use your number 13 for? Said Anderson, conscious, as he said the words, of a curious anxiety, quite disproportionate to the importance of the question. My number 13? Why, don't I tell you that there isn't such a thing in the house? I thought you might have noticed that. If there was, it would be next door to your own room. Well, yes, only I happen to think... that is, I fancied last night that I'd seen a door number 13 in that passage, and really, I'm almost certain I must have been right, for I saw it the night before as well. Of course, Sir Christiansen laughed this notion to scorn, as Anderson had expected, and emphasized with much iteration the fact that no number 13 existed or had existed before him in that hotel. Anderson was in some ways relieved by this certainty, but still puzzled, and he began to think that the best way to make sure whether he had indeed been subject to an illusion or not was to invite the landlord to his room to smoke a cigar later on in the evening. Some photographs of English towns which he had with him formed a sufficiently good excuse. Christiansen was flattered by the invitation and most willingly accepted it. At about 10 o'clock, he was to make his appearance, but before that Anderson had some letters to write and retired for the purpose of writing them. He almost blushed to himself at confessing it, but he could not deny that it was the fact that he was becoming quite nervous about the question of the existence of number 13. So much so that he approached his room by way of number 11 in order that he might not be obliged to pass the door or the place where the door ought to be. He looked quickly and suspiciously about the room when he entered it, but there was nothing beyond that indefinable air of being smaller than usual to warrant any misgivings. There was no question of the presence or absence of his portmanteau tonight. He had himself emptied it of its contents and lodged it under his bed. With a certain effort, he dismissed the thought of number 13 from his mind and sat down to his writing. His neighbours were quiet enough. Occasionally a door opened in the passage and a pair of boots was thrown out, or a bagman walked past humming to himself, and outside, from time to time, a cart thundered over the atrocious cobblestones, or a quick step hurried along the flags. Anderson finished his letters, ordered in whiskey and soda, and then went to the window and studied the dead wall opposite, and the shadows upon it. As far as he could remember, number 14 had been occupied by the lawyer, a staid man who said little at meals, being generally engaged in studying a small bundle of papers beside his plate. Apparently, however, he was in the habit of giving vent to his animal spirits when alone. Why else should he be dancing? The shadow from the next room evidently showed that he was. Again and again his thin form crossed the window, his arms waved, and a gaunt leg was kicked up with surprising agility. He seemed to be barefooted, and the floor must be well laid, for no sound betrayed his movements. Sagfører Herr Anders Jensen, dancing at 10 o'clock at night in a hotel bedroom, seemed a fitting subject for any historical painting in the grand style, and Anderson's thoughts, like those of Emily in The Mysteries of Udolpho, began to arrange themselves in the following lines. When I return to my hotel at 10 o'clock p.m., the waiters think I am unwell. I do not care for them, but when I've locked my chamber door and put my boots outside, I dance all night upon the floor, and even if my neighbours swore I'd go on dancing all the more, for I'm acquainted with the law, and despite of all their jaw, their protests I deride. Had not the landlord at this moment knocked at the door, it is probable that quite a long poem might have been laid before the reader. To judge from his look of surprise when he found himself in the room, Herr Christiansen was struck, as Andersen had been, by something unusual in its aspect, but he made no remark. Andersen's photographs interested him mightily, and formed the text of many autobiographical discourses. Nor is it quite clear how the conversation could have been diverted into the desired channel of number 13, had not the lawyer at this moment begun to sing, and to sing in a manner which could leave no doubt in anyone's mind that he was either exceedingly drunk or raving mad. It was a high, thin voice that they heard, and it seemed dry, as if from long disuse. Of words or tune there was no question. It went sailing up to a surprising height, and was carried down with the despairing moan as of a winter wind in a hollow chimney, or an organ whose wind fails suddenly. It was a really horrible sound, and Andersen felt that if he had been alone he must have fled for refuge in society to some neighbour bagman's room. The landlord sat open-mouthed. I don't understand it, he said at last, wiping his forehead. It is dreadful. I've heard it once before, but I made sure it was a cat. Is he mad? Said Andersen. He must be. And what a sad thing. Such a good customer too, and so successful in his business, by what I hear, and a young family to bring up. Just then came an impatient knock at the door, and the knocker entered without waiting to be asked. It was the lawyer in dishabille, and very rough-haired, and very angry he looked. I beg pardon, sir, he said, but I should be much obliged if you would kindly desist. He stopped, for it was evident that neither of the persons before him was responsible for the disturbance, and after a moment's lull, it swelled forth again more wildly than before. But what in the name of heaven does it mean? Broke out the lawyer. Where is it? Who is it? Am I going out of my mind? Surely, Herr Jensen, it comes from your room next door. Isn't there a cat or something stuck in your chimney? This was the best that occurred to Andersen to say, and he realized its futility as he spoke. But anything was better than to stand and listen to that horrible voice, and look at the broad white face of the landlord, all perspiring and quivering, as he clutched the arms of his chair. Impossible, said the lawyer. Impossible. There is no chimney. I came here because I was convinced the noise was going on here. It was certainly in the room next to mine. Was there no door between yours and mine? Said Andersen eagerly. No, sir, said Herr Jensen rather sharply, at least, not this morning. Ah, said Andersen. Nor tonight. I'm not sure, said the lawyer with some hesitation. Suddenly the crying or singing voice in the next room died away, and the singer was heard seemingly to laugh to himself in a crooning manner. The three men actually shivered at the sound. Then there was a silence. Come, said the lawyer. What have you to say, Herr Christiansen? What does this mean? Good heavens, said Christiansen. How should I tell? I know no more than you, gentlemen. I pray I may never hear such a noise again. So do I, said Herr Jensen, and he added something under his breath. Andersen thought it sounded like the last words of the Psalter, Omnis spiritus laudet Dominum, but he couldn't be sure. But we must do something, said Andersen, the three of us. Shall we go and investigate in the next room? But that is Herr Jensen's room, wailed the landlord. It is no use, he has come from there himself. I am not so sure, said Jensen. I think this gentleman is right. We must go and see. The only weapons of defence that could be mustered on the spot were a stick and umbrella. The expedition went out into the passage, not without quakings. There was a deadly quiet outside, but a light shone from under the next door. Andersen and Jensen approached it. The latter turned the handle and gave a sudden, vigorous push. No use. The door stood fast. Herr Christiansen, said Jensen, will you go and fetch the strongest servant you have in the place? We must see this through. The landlord nodded and hurried off, glad to be away from the scene of action. Jensen and Andersen remained outside, looking at the door. It is number 13, you say, said the latter. Yes, there is your door, and there is mine, said Jensen. My room has 3 windows in the daytime, said Anderson with difficulty suppressing a nervous laugh. By George! So has mine, said the lawyer, turning and looking at Anderson. His back was now to the door. In that moment, the door opened, and an arm came out and clawed at his shoulder. It was clad in ragged yellowish linen, and the bare skin, where it could be seen, had long grey hair upon it. Anderson was just in time to pull Jensen out of its reach with a cry of disgust and fright when the door shut again, and a low laugh was heard. Jensen had seen nothing, but when Anderson hurriedly told him what a risk he had run, he fell into a great state of agitation and suggested that they should retire from the enterprise and lock themselves up in one or other of their rooms. However, while he was developing this plan, the landlord and 2 able-bodied men arrived on the scene, all looking rather serious and alarmed. Jensen met them with a torrent of description and explanation, which did not at all tend to encourage them for the fray. The men dropped the crowbars they had brought and said flatly that they were not going to risk their throats in that devil's den. The landlord was miserably nervous and undecided, conscious that if the danger were not faced, his hotel was ruined, and very loath to face it himself. Luckily, Anderson hit upon a way of rallying the demoralized force. "Is this," he said, "the Danish courage I have heard so much of? It isn't a German in there, and if it was, we are 5 to 1. The 2 servants and Jensen were stung into action by this and made a dash at the door. "Stop," said Anderson. "Don't lose your heads. You stay out here with the light, landlord, and one of you 2 men break in the door, and don't go in when it gives way." The men nodded, and the younger stepped forward, raised his crowbar, and dealt a tremendous blow on the upper panel. The result was not in the least what any of them anticipated. There was no cracking or rending of wood, only a dull sound, as if the solid wall had been struck. The man dropped his tool with a shout and began rubbing his elbow. His cry drew their eyes upon him for a moment, then Anderson looked at the door again. It was gone. The plaster wall of the passage stared him in the face, with a considerable gash in it where the crowbar had struck. Number 13 had passed out of existence. For a brief space they stood perfectly still, gazing at the blank wall. An early cock in the yard beneath was heard to crow, and as Anderson glanced in the direction of the sound, he saw through the window at the end of the long passage that the eastern sky was paling to the dawn. "Perhaps," said the landlord with hesitation, "you gentlemen would like another room for tonight, a double-bedded one." Neither Jensen nor Anderson was averse to the suggestion. They felt inclined to hunt in couples after their late experience. It was found convenient, when each of them went to his room to collect the articles he wanted for the night, that the other should go with him and hold the candle. They noticed that both number 12 and number 14 had 3 windows. Next morning, the same party reassembled in number 12. The landlord was naturally anxious to avoid engaging outside help, and yet it was imperative that the mystery attaching to that part of the house should be cleared up. Accordingly, the 2 servants had been induced to take upon them the function of carpenters. The furniture was cleared away, and, at the cost of a good many irretrievably damaged planks, that portion of the floor was taken up which lay nearest to number 14. You will naturally suppose that a skeleton, say that of Magister Nicholas Franken, was discovered. That was not so. What they did find, lying between the beams which supported the flooring, was a small copper box. In it was a neatly folded vellum document with about 20 lines of writing. Both Anderson and Jensen, who proved to be something of a paleographer, were much excited by this discovery, which promised to afford the key to these extraordinary phenomena. "I possess a copy of an astrological work which I have never read. It has, by way of frontispiece, a woodcut by Hans Sebold Behm, representing a number of sages seated round a table. This detail may enable connoisseurs to identify the book. I cannot myself recollect its title, and it is not at this moment within reach, but the fly-leaves of it are covered with writing, and during the 10 years in which I have owned the volume, I have not been able to determine which way up this writing ought to be read, much less in what language it is. Not dissimilar was the position of Anderson and Jensen after the protracted examination to which they submitted the document in the copper box. After 2 days' contemplation of it, Jensen, who was the bolder spirit of the two, hazarded the conjecture that the language was either Latin or Old Danish. Anderson ventured upon no surmises, and was very willing to surrender the box and the parchment to the Historical Society of Viborg to be placed in their museum. I had the whole story from him a few months later as we sat in a wood near Uppsala after a visit to the library there, where we, or rather I, had laughed over the contract by which Daniel Saltanius, in later life professor of Hebrew at Königsberg, sold himself to Satan. Anderson was not really amused. "Young idiot," he said, meaning Saltanius, who was only an undergraduate when he had committed that indiscretion. How did he know what company he was courting? And when I suggested the usual considerations, he only grunted. That afternoon, he told me what you have read, but he refused to draw any inferences from it, and to assent to any that I drew for him.
The Experiment by M.R. James. A New Year's Eve Ghost Story. The Reverend Dr. Hall was in his study making up the entries for the year in the parish register, it being his custom to note baptisms, weddings and burials in a paper book as they occurred, and in the last days of December to write them out fairly in the vellum book that was kept in the parish chest. To him entered his housekeeper in evident agitation. "Oh, sir," said she, "whatever do you think? The poor squire's gone." "The squire? Squire Bowles? What are you talking about, woman? Why, only yesterday—" "Yes, I know, sir, but it's the truth. Wickham, the clerk, just left word on his way down to toll the bell. You'll hear it yourself in a minute. There now, just listen." Sure enough, the sound broke on the still night, not loud, for the rectory did not immediately adjoin the churchyard. Dr. Hall rose hastily. "Terrible, terrible," he said. "I must see them at the Hall at once. He seemed so greatly better yesterday." He paused. "Did you hear any word of the sickness having come this way at all? There's nothing said in Norwich. It seems so sudden." "No, indeed, sir, no such thing. Just caught away with a choking in his throat, Wickham says. It do make one feel, well, I'm sure I had to set down as much as a minute or more. I came over that queer when I heard the words, and by what I could understand, they'll be asking for the burial very quick. The some can't bear the thought of the old corpse laying in the house, and yes, well, I must find out from Madame Bowles herself, or Mr. Joseph. Get me my cloak, will you? Ah, and could you let Wickham know that I desire to see him when the tolling's over?" He hurried off. In an hour's time he was back, and found Wickham waiting for him. "There is work for you, Wickham," he said as he threw off his cloak, "and not over much time to do it in." "Yes, sir," said Wickham. "The vault to be opened, be sure." No, that's not the message I have. The poor squire, they tell me, charged them before now not to lay him in the chancel. It was to be an earth grave in the yard, on the north side. He stopped at an inarticulate exclamation from the clerk. "Well?" he said. "I ask pardon, sir," said Wickham in a shocked voice, "but did I understand you right? No vault, you say? And on the north side? Why, the poor gentleman must have been wandering." "Yes, it does seem strange to me too," said Dr. Hall, "but no, Mr. Joseph tells me it was his father's, I should say stepfather's, clear wish, expressed more than once, and when he was in good health. Clean earth and open air. You know, of course, that the poor squire had his fancies, though he never spoke of this one to me, and there's another thing, Wickham. No coffin." "Oh, dear, sir," said Wickham, yet more shocked. "Oh, but that'll make sad talk, that will, and what a disappointment for Mr. Wright, too. I know he'd looked out some beautiful wood for the squire and had it by him years past." Well, perhaps the family will make it up to Wright in some way," said the rector rather impatiently. "But what you have to do is get the grave dug and all the things in a readiness. Torches from Wright, you must not forget, by 10 o'clock tomorrow night. I don't doubt but there'll be somewhat coming to you for your pains and hurry." "Very well, sir, if those be the orders, I must do my best to carry them out. And should I call in on my way down and send the women up to the hall to lay out the bodies, sir?" "No, that, I think, I'm sure, was not spoken of." Mr. Joseph will send, no doubt, if they are needed. No, you have enough without that. Good night, Wickham. I was making up the registers when this doleful news came in. Little had I thought to add such an entry to them as I must now. All things had been done in decent order. The torch-lighted cortege had passed from the hall through the park, up the lime avenue to the top of the knoll on which the church stood. All the village had been there, and such neighbours as could be warned in the few hours available. There was no great surprise at the hurry. Formalities of law there were none then, and no one blamed the stricken widow for hastening to lay her dead to rest. Nor did anyone look to see her following in the funeral train. Her son Joseph, only issue of her first marriage with a Calvert of Yorkshire, was the chief mourner. There were indeed no kinsfolk on Squire Bowles's side who could have been bidden. The will, executed at the time of the squire's second marriage, left everything to the widow. And what was everything? Land, house, furniture, pictures, plate were all obvious. But there should have been accumulations in coin, and beyond a few hundreds in the hands of agents, honest men and no embezzlers, cash, there was none. Yet Francis Bowles had for years received good rents and paid little out. Nor was he a reputed miser. He kept a good table, and money was always forthcoming for the moderate spendings of his wife and stepson. Joseph Calvert had been maintained ungrudgingly at school and college. What then had he done with it all? No ransacking of the house brought any secret hoard to light. No servant, old or young, had any tale to tell of meeting the squire in unexpected places at strange hours. No, Madame Bowles and her son were fairly nonplussed. As they sat one evening in the parlour discussing the problem for the 20th time, "You have been at his books and papers, Joseph, again today, haven't you?" "Yes, mother, and no forwarder." "What was it he would be writing at, and why was he always sending letters to Mr. Fowler at Gloucester?" "Why, you know he had a maggot about the middle state of the soul. It was over that he and the other were always busy. The last thing he wrote would be a letter that he never finished. I'll fetch it. Yes, the same song over again. Honoured friend, I make some slow advance in our studies, but I know not well how far to trust our authors. Here is one lately come my way. You will have it, for a time after death the soul is under the control of certain spirits, as Raphael, and another whom I doubtfully read as Nares, but still so near to this state of life that on prayer to them he may be free to come and disclose matters to the living. Come indeed, he must, if he be rightly called, the manner of which is set forth in an experiment. But having come and once opened his mouth, it may chance that his summoner shall see and hear more than of the hid treasure, which it is likely he bargained for, since the experiment puts this at the forefront of things to be inquired. But the eftest way is to send you the whole, which herewith I do, copied from a book of recipes which I had of good Bishop Moore." Here Joseph stopped and made no comment, gazing at the paper. For more than a minute nothing was said. Then Madame Bowles, drawing her needle through her work and looking at it, coughed and said, "There was no more written?" "No, nothing, mother." "No? Well, it's strange stuff. Did you ever meet this Mr. Fowler?" "Yes, it might be once or twice, in Oxford. A civil gentleman enough." "Now I think of it," said she, "it would be right to acquaint him with what has happened. They were close friends. Yes, Joseph, you should do that. You will know what should be said. The letter is his, after all." "You're in the right, mother, and I'll not delay it." And forthwith he sat down to write. From Norfolk to Gloucester was no quick transit, but a letter went, and a larger packet came in answer, and there were more evening talks in the panelled parlour at the hall. At the close of one, these words were said: "Tonight, then, if you are certain of yourself, go round by the field path. Aye, and here is a cloth will serve." "What cloth is that, mother? A napkin?" "Yes, of a kind. What matter?" So he went out by the way of the garden, and she stood in the door musing, with her hand on her mouth. Then the hand dropped, and she said half aloud, "If only I had not been so hurried." But it was the face-cloth, sure enough. It was a very dark night, and the spring wind blew loud over the black fields, loud enough to drown all sounds of shouting or calling. If calling there was no voice, nor any that answered, nor any that regarded, yet. Next morning Joseph's mother was early in his chamber. "Give me the cloth," she said. "The maids must not find it, and tell me, quick." Joseph, seated on the side of the bed with his head in his hands, looked up at her with bloodshot eyes. "We have opened his mouth," he said. "Why in God's name did you leave his face bare?" "How could I help it? You know how I was hurried that day." "But do you mean that you saw it?" Joseph only groaned and sunk his head in his hands again. Then, in a low voice, he said you should see it too. With a dreadful gasp, she clutched at the bedpost and clung to it. "Oh, but he's angry," Joseph went on. "He was only biding his time, I'm sure. The words were scarce out of my mouth when I heard, like the snarl of a dog, in under there." Got up and paced the room. "And what can we do? He's free, and I daren't meet him. I daren't take the drink and go where he is. I daren't lie there another night. Oh, why did you do it? We could have waited." "Hush," said his mother. Her lips were dry. "'Twas you know it as much as I. Besides, what's use in talking? Listen to me. 'Tis but 6 o'clock. There's money to cross the water, such as they can't follow. Yarmouth's not so far, and most night boats sail for Holland, I've heard. See you to the horses. I can be ready." Joseph stared at her. "What will they say here?" "What? Why, cannot you tell the parson we have wind of property lying in Amsterdam, which we must claim or lose? Go, if you're not man enough for that, lie here again tonight." He shivered and went. That evening, after dark, a boatman lumbered into an inn on Yarmouth Quay, where a man and woman sat with saddlebags on the floor by them. "Ready are you, mistress and gentlemen," he said. "She sails before the hour, and my other passenger, he's waiting on the quay. Be there all your baggage?" And he picked up the bags. "Yes, we travel light," said Joseph. "And you have more company bound for Holland?" "Just the one," said the boatman, "and he seemed to travel lighter yet." "Do you know him?" said Madame Bowles. She laid her hand on Joseph's arm, and they both paused in the doorway. "Why, no, but for all he's hooded, I'd know him again fast enough. He have such a curious way of speaking, and I doubt you'll find he know you by what he said. 'Go you, and fetch him out,' he say, 'and I'll wait on them here,' he say. And sure enough, he's a-coming this way now." Poisoning of a husband was petty treason then, and women guilty of it were strangled at the stake and burnt. The assize records of Norwich tell of a woman so dealt with, and of her son hanged thereafter, convict on their own confession, made before the rector of their parish, the name of which I withhold, for there is still hid treasure to be found there. Bishop Moore's Book of Recipes is now in the University Library at Cambridge, marked DD 1145, and on the leaf numbered 144, this is written: "An experiment most oft proved true, to find out treasure hidden in the ground, theft, manslaughter, or any other thing. Go to the grave of a dead man, and 3 times call him by his name at the head of the grave, and say, 'Thou, name, I conjure thee, I require thee, and I charge thee by the Christendom that thou takest leave of the Lord Raphael and Nares, and then askest leave this night to come and tell me truly of the treasure that lieth hid in such a place. Then take of the earth of the grave at the dead body's head, and knit it in a linen cloth, and put it under thy right ear, and sleep thereupon. And wheresoever thou liest or sleepest, that night he will come and tell thee truly, in waking or sleeping."
The Mezzotint by M.R. James. Some time ago, I believe I had the pleasure of telling you the story of an adventure which happened to a friend of mine by the name of Denistone during his pursuit of objects of art for the museum at Cambridge. He did not publish his experiences very widely upon his return to England, but they could not fail to become known to a good many of his friends, and among others to the gentleman who at that time presided over an art museum at another university. It was to be expected that the story should make a considerable impression on the mind of a man
whose vocation lay in lines similar to Denniston's, and that he should be eager to catch at any explanation of the matter which tended to make it seem improbable that he should ever be called upon to deal with so agitating an emergency. It was indeed somewhat consoling to him to reflect that he was not expected to acquire ancient manuscripts for his institution. That was the business of the Shelburnian Library. The authorities of that institution might, if they pleased, ransack obscure corners of the continent for such matters. He was glad to be obliged at the moment to confine his attention to enlarging the already unsurpassed collection of English topographical drawings and engravings possessed by his museum. Yet, as it turned out, even a department so homely and familiar as this may have its dark corners, and to one of these, Mr. Williams was unexpectedly introduced. Those who have taken even the most limited interest in the acquisition of topographical pictures are aware that there is one London dealer whose aid is indispensable to their researches. Mr. J.W. Bricknell publishes at short intervals very admirable catalogues of a large and constantly changing stock of engravings, plans, and old sketches of mansions, churches, and towns in England and Wales. These catalogues were, of course, the ABC of his subject to Mr. Williams, but as his museum already contained an enormous accumulation of topographical pictures, he was a regular rather than a copious buyer, and he rather looked to Mr. Bricknell to fill up gaps in the rank and file of his collection and to supply him with rarities. Now, in February of last year, there appeared upon Mr. Williams's desk at the museum a catalogue from Mr. Bricknell's emporium, and accompanying it was a typewritten communication from the dealer himself. This latter ran as follows: Dear Sir, we beg to call your attention to number 978 in our accompanying catalogue, which we shall be glad to send on approval. Yours faithfully, J.W. Bricknell. To turn to number 978 in the accompanying catalogue was with Mr. Williams, as he observed to himself, the work of a moment, and in the place indicated he found the following entry. 978. Unknown. Interesting Mezzotint. View of a manor house, early part of the century. 15 by 10 inches, black frame, 2 guineas. It was not specially exciting, and the price seemed high. However, as Mr. Bricknell, who knew his business and his customer, seemed to set store by it, Mr. Williams wrote a postcard asking for the article to be sent on approval, along with some other engravings and sketches which appeared in the same catalogue. And so he passed without much excitement of anticipation to the ordinary labours of the day. A parcel of any kind always arrives a day later than you expect, and that of Mr. Bricknell proved, as I believe the right phrase goes, no exception to the rule. It was delivered at the museum by the afternoon post of Saturday, after Mr. Williams had left his work, and it was accordingly brought round to his rooms in college by the attendant, in order that he might not have to wait over Sunday before looking through it, and returning such of the contents as he did not propose to keep. And here he found it when he came in to tea with a friend. The only item with which I am concerned was the rather large, black-framed Mezzotint, of which I have already quoted the short description given in Mr. Bricknell's catalogue. Some more details of it will have to be given, though I cannot hope to put before you the look of the picture as clearly as it is present to my own eye. Very near the exact duplicate of it may be seen in a good many old inn parlours, or in the passages of undisturbed country mansions at the present moment. It was a rather indifferent Mezzotint, and an indifferent Mezzotint is perhaps the worst form of engraving known. It presented a full-face view of a not very large manor house of the last century, with 3 rows of plain sashed windows with rusticated masonry about them, a parapet with balls or vases at the angles, and a small portico in the centre. On either side were trees, and in front a considerable expanse of lawn. The legend AWF Sculpsit was engraved on the narrow margin, and there was no further inscription. The whole thing gave the impression that it was the work of an amateur. What in the world Mr. Bricknell could mean by affixing the price of 2 guineas to such an object was more than Mr. Williams could imagine. He turned it over with a good deal of contempt. Upon the back was a paper label, the left hand of which had been torn off. All that remained were the ends of 2 lines of writing. The first had the letters Ingley Hall, and the second, sex. It would perhaps be just worthwhile to identify the place represented, which you could easily do with the help of a gazetteer, and then he would send it back to Mr. Britnell with some remarks reflecting upon the judgment of that gentleman. He lighted the candles, for it was now dark, made the tea, and supplied the friend with whom he had been playing golf, for I believe the authorities of the university I write of indulge in that pursuit by way of relaxation, and tea was taken to the accompaniment of a discussion which golfing persons can imagine for themselves, but which the conscientious writer has no right to inflict upon any non-golfing persons. The conclusion arrived at was that certain strokes might have been better, and that in certain emergencies neither player had experienced that amount of luck which a human being has a right to expect. It was now that the friend, let's call him Professor Binks, took up the framed engraving and said, "What's this place, Williams?" "Just what I'm going to try to find out," said Williams, going to the shelf for a gazetteer. "Look at the back. Something Lee Hall, either in Sussex or Essex. Half the name's gone, you see. You don't happen to know it, I suppose." "It's from that man Britnell, I suppose, isn't it?" said Binks. "Is it for the museum?" "Well, I think I should buy it if the price was 5 shillings, said Williams. "But for some unearthly reason he wants 2 guineas for it. I can't conceive why. It's a wretched engraving, and there aren't even any figures to give it life." "It's not worth 2 guineas, I should think," said Binks, "but I don't think it's so badly done. The moonlight seems rather good to me, and I should have thought there were figures, or at least a figure, just on the edge at the front." "Let's look," said Williams. "Well, it's true the light is rather cleverly given. Where's your figure?" "Oh, yes, just the head, in the very front of the picture." And indeed there was hardly more than a black blot on the extreme edge of the engraving, the head of a man or a woman, a good deal muffled up, the back turned to the spectator and looking towards the house. Williams had not noticed it before. "Still," he said, "though it's a cleverer thing than I thought, I can't spend 2 guineas of museum money on a picture of a place I don't know." Professor Binks had his work to do and soon went, and very nearly up to hall time Williams was engaged in a vain attempt to identify the subject of his picture. If the vowel before the NG had only been left, it would have been easy enough, he thought. But as it is, the name might be anything from Guestingley to Langley, and there are many more names ending like this than I thought, and this rotten book has no index of terminations. Hall in Mr. Williams's college was at 7. It need not be dwelt upon, the less so as he met their colleagues who had been playing golf during the afternoon, and words which we have no concern were freely bandied across the table, merely golfing words, I would hasten to explain. I suppose an hour or more to have been spent in what is called common room after dinner. Later in the evening some few retired to Williams's rooms, and I have little doubt that whist was played and tobacco smoked. During a lull in these operations, Williams picked up the Mezzotint from the table without looking at it and handed it to a person mildly interested in art, telling him where it had come from and the other particulars which we already know. The gentleman took it carelessly, looked at it, then said in a tone of some interest, "It's really a very good piece of work, Williams. It has quite a feeling of the Romantic period. The light is admirably managed, it seems to me, and the figure, though it's rather too grotesque, is somehow very impressive." "Yes, isn't it?" said Williams, who was just then busy giving whisky and soda to others of the company, and was unable to come across the room to look at the view again. It was by this time rather late in the evening, and the visitors were on the move. After they went, Williams was obliged to write a letter or two and clear up some odd bits of work. At last, some time past midnight, he was disposed to turn in, and he put out his lamp after lighting his bedroom candles. The picture lay face upwards on the table where the last man who looked at it had put it, and it caught his eye as he turned the lamp down. What he saw made him very nearly drop the candle on the floor, and he declares now, if he had been left in the dark at that moment, he would have had a fit. But, as that didn't happen, he was able to put down the light on the table and take a good look at the picture. It was indubitable, rankly impossible, no doubt, but absolutely certain. In the middle of the lawn in front of the unknown house, there was a figure, where no figure had been at 5 o'clock that afternoon. It was crawling on all fours towards the house, and it was muffled in a strange black garment with a white cross on the back. I do not know what is the ideal course to pursue in a situation of this kind. I can only tell you what Mr. Williams did. He took the picture by one corner and carried it across the passage to a second set of rooms which he possessed. There, he locked it up in a drawer, sported the doors of both sets of rooms, and retired to bed. But first he wrote out and signed an account of the extraordinary change which the picture had undergone since it had come into his possession. Sleep visited him rather late, but it was consoling to reflect that the behaviour of the picture did not depend upon his own unsupported testimony. Evidently, the man who had looked at it the night before had seen something of the same kind as he had. Otherwise, he might have been tempted to think that something gravely wrong was happening, either to his eyes or his mind. This possibility being fortunately precluded, two matters awaited him on the morrow. He must take stock of the picture very carefully and call in a witness for the purpose, and he must make a determined effort to ascertain what house it was that was represented. He would therefore ask his neighbour Nisbet to breakfast with him, and he would subsequently spend a morning over the gazetteer. Nisbet was disengaged and arrived about 9:20 a.m. His host was not quite dressed, I'm sorry to say, even at this late hour. During breakfast, nothing was said about the Mezzotint by Williams, save that he had a picture, and he wished for Nisbet's opinion. But those who are familiar with university life can picture for themselves the wide and delightful range of subjects over which the conversation of two fellows of Canterbury College is likely to extend during a Sunday morning breakfast. Hardly a topic was left unchallenged, from golf to lawn tennis. Yet I am bound to say that Williams was rather distraught, for his interest naturally centred in that very strange picture which was now reposing face downwards in the drawer in the room opposite. The morning pipe was at last lighted, and the moment had arrived for which he looked. With very considerable, almost tremulous excitement, he ran across, unlocked the drawer, and extracting the picture, still face downwards, ran back and put it into Nisbet's hands. "Now," he said, "Nisbet, I want you to tell me exactly what you see in the picture. Describe it, if you don't mind, rather minutely. I'll tell you why afterwards." "Well," said Nisbet, "I have here a view of a country house, English, I presume, by moonlight." "Moonlight? You're sure of that?" "Certainly. The moon appears to be on the wane, if you wish for details, and there are clouds in the sky." "All right, go on. I'll swear," added Williams in an aside, "there was no moon when I saw it first." "Well, there's not much more to be said," Nisbet continued. "The house has 3 rows of windows, 5 in each row except at the bottom, where there's a porch instead of the middle one, and—" "But what about figures?" said Williams with marked interest. "There aren't any," said Nisbet, "but—" "What, no figure on the grass in front?" "Not a thing. You'll swear to that?" "Certainly I will, but there's just one other thing." "What?" "Why, one of the windows on the ground floor, left of the door, is open." "Is it really so? My goodness." "You must have got in," said Williams, with great excitement, and he hurried to the back of the sofa on which Nisbet was sitting, and catching the picture from him, verified the matter for himself. It was quite true. There was no figure, and there was the open window. Williams, after a moment of speechless surprise, went to the writing table and scribbled for a short time. Then he brought 2 papers to Nisbet and asked him first to sign one, it was his own description of the picture which you have just heard, and then to read the other, which was Williams's statement written the night before. "What can it all mean?" said Nisbet. "Exactly," said Williams. "Well, one thing I must do, or 3 things now I think of it. I must find out from Garwood, this was his last night's visitor, what he saw, and then I must get the thing photographed before it goes further, and then I must find out what the place is." "I can do the photographing myself," said Nisbet, "and I will, but, you know, it looks very much as if we were assisting at the working out of a tragedy somehow. The question is, has it happened already, or is it going to come off? You must find out what the place is, yes," he said, looking at the picture again. "I expect you're right. He has got in. And if I don't mistake, there'll be the devil to pay in one of the rooms upstairs. I'll tell you what," said Williams, "I'll take the picture across to old Green." This was the senior fellow of the college who had been bursar for many years. "It's quite likely he'll know it. We have property in Essex and Sussex, and he must have been over the 2 counties a lot in his time." "Quite likely he will," said Nisbet, "but just let me take my photograph first. But look here, I rather think Green isn't up today. He wasn't in hall last night, and I think I heard him say he was going down for the Sunday." "That's true too," said Williams. I know he's gone to Brighton. Well, if you'll photograph it now, I'll go across to Garwood and get his statement, and you keep an eye on it while I'm gone. I'm beginning to think 2 guineas is not a very exorbitant price for it now." In a short time he had returned and brought Mr. Garwood with him. Garwood's statement was to the effect that the figure, when he had seen it, was clear of the edge of the picture but had not got far across the lawn. He remembered a white mark on the back of its drapery, but couldn't be sure it was a cross. A document to this effect was drawn up and signed, and Nisbet proceeded to photograph the picture. "Now what do you mean to do?" he said. "Are you going to sit and watch it all day?" "Well, no, I think not," said Williams. "I rather imagine we're meant to see the whole thing. You see, between the time I saw it last night and this morning, there was time for lots of things to happen. But the creature only got into the house. It could easily have got through its business in the time and gone to its own place again, but the fact of the window being open, I think, must mean that it's in there now. So I feel quite easy about leaving it, and besides, I have a kind of idea that it wouldn't change much, if at all, in the daytime. We might go out for a walk this afternoon and come in to tea, or whenever it gets dark. I shall leave it out on the table here and sport the door. My skip can get in, but no one else." The three agreed that this would be a good plan, and further, that if they spent the afternoon together, they would be less likely to talk about the business to other people. For any rumour of such a transaction as was going on would bring the whole of the Phantasmalogical Society about their ears. We may give them a respite until 5 o'clock. At or near that hour, the three were entering Williams's staircase. They were at first slightly annoyed to see that the door of his rooms was unsported, but in a moment it was remembered that on Sunday the skips came in for orders an hour or so earlier than on weekdays. However, a surprise was awaiting them. The first thing they saw was the picture leaning up against a pile of books on the table, as it had been left, and the next thing was Williams's skip, seated on a chair opposite, gazing at it with undisguised horror. How was this? Mr. Filcher, the name is not my own invention, was a servant of considerable standing, and set the standard of etiquette to all his own college and to several neighbouring ones, and nothing could be more alien to his practice than to be found sitting on his master's chair, or appearing to take any particular notice of his master's furniture or pictures. Indeed, he seemed to feel this himself. He started violently when the three men were in the room, and got up with a marked effort. Then he said, "I ask your pardon, sir, for taking such a freedom as to set down." "Not at all, Robert," interposed Mr. Williams. "I was meaning to ask you sometime what you thought of that picture." "Well, sir, of course I don't set up my opinions against yours, but it ain't the picture I should hang where my little girl could see it, sir." "Wouldn't you, Robert? Why not?" "No, sir, why, the poor child, I recollect once she seen a door Bible with pictures not half what that is. We had to set it with her 3 or 4 nights afterwards, if you believe me, and if she was to catch a sight of this skeleton here, or whatever it is, carrying off the poor baby, she would be in a taking. You know how it is with children, how nervous they get with a little thing and all. But what I should say, it don't seem a right picture to be laying about, sir. Not where anyone that's liable to be startled could come on it. Should you be wanting anything this evening, sir? Thank you, sir." With these words, the excellent man went to continue the round of his masters, and you may be sure the gentlemen whom he left lost no time in gathering around the engraving. There was the house, as before, under the waning moon and the drifting clouds. The window that had been open was shut, and the figure was once more on the lawn, but not this time crawling cautiously on hands and knees. Now it was erect and stepping swiftly with long strides towards the front of the picture. The moon was behind it, and the black drapery hung down over its face, so that only hints of that could be seen. And what was visible made the spectators profoundly thankful that they could see no more than a white dome-like forehead and a few straggling hairs. The head was bent down, and the arms were tightly clasped over an object which could be dimly seen and identified as a child. Whether dead or living, it was not possible to say. The legs of the appearance alone could be plainly discerned, and they were horribly thin. From 5 to 7, the three companions sat and watched the picture by turns, but it never changed. They agreed at last that it would be safe to leave it, and that they would return after Hall and await further developments. When they assembled again at the earliest possible moment, the engraving was there, but the figure was gone, and the house was quiet under the moonbeams. There was nothing for it but to spend the evening over gazetteers and guidebooks. Williams was the lucky one at last, and perhaps he deserved it. At 11:30 p.m., he read from Murray's Guide to Essex the following lines. 16.5 miles, Anningley. The church has been an interesting building of Norman date, but was extensively classicised in the last century. It contains the tomb of the family of Francis, whose mansion, Anningley Hall, a solid Queen Anne house, stands immediately beyond the churchyard in a park of about 80 acres. The family is now extinct, the last heir having disappeared mysteriously in infancy in the year 1802. The father, Mr. Arthur Francis, was locally known as a talented amateur engraver in Mezzotint. After his son's disappearance, he lived in complete retirement at the Hall and was found dead in his studio on the 3rd anniversary of the disaster, having just completed an engraving of the house, impressions of which are of considerable rarity. This looked like business, and indeed Mr. Green on his return at once identified the house as Anningley Hall. "Is there any kind of explanation of the figure, Green?" was the question which Williams naturally asked. "I don't know, I'm sure, Williams. What used to be said in the place when I first knew it, which was before I came up here, was just this. Old Francis was always very much down on these poaching fellows, and whenever he got a chance he used to get a man whom he suspected of it turned off the estate, and by degrees he got rid of them all but one. Squires could do a lot of things then that they daren't think of now. Well, this man that was left was what you find pretty often in that county, the last remains of a very old family. I believe they were lords of the manor at one time. I recollect just the same thing in my own parish." "What, like the man in Tess of the D'Urbervilles?" Williams put in. "Yes, I dare say. It's not a book I could ever read myself, but this fellow could show a row of tombs in the church there that belonged to his ancestors, and all that went to sour him a bit. But Francis, they said, could never get at him. He always kept just on the right side of the law, until one night the keepers found him at it in a wood right at the end of the estate. I could show you the place now. It marches with some land that used to belong to an uncle of mine. And you can imagine there was a row. And this man, Gaudy, I thought I should get it, Gaudy. He was unlucky enough, poor chap, to shoot a keeper. Well, that was what Francis wanted, and grand juries, you know what they would have been then. And poor Gaudy was strung up in double quick time. And I've been shown the place he was buried in, on the north side of the church. You know the way in that part of the world. Anyone that's been hanged or made away with themselves, they bury them on that side. And the idea was that some friend of Gaudy's, not a relation because he had none, poor devil, must have planned to get hold of Francis's boy and put an end to his line too. I don't know, it's rather an out-of-the-way thing for an Essex poacher to think of, but you know, I should say now it looks more as if old Gaudy had managed the job himself. Boo, I hate to think of it. Have some whiskey, Williams." The facts were communicated by Williams to Dennis Toone, and by him to a mixed company, of which I was one, and the Sadducean professor of ophiology another. I'm sorry to say that the latter, when asked what he thought of it, only remarked, "Oh, those Bridgeford people will say anything," a sentiment which met with the reception it deserved. I have only to add that the picture is now in the Ashleyan Museum, that it has been treated with a view to discovering whether sympathetic ink has been used in it, but without effect. That Mr. Britnell knew nothing of it, save that he was sure it was uncommon, and that, though carefully watched, it has never been known to change again.
The Story of a Disappearance and an Appearance by M.R. James. The letters which I now publish were sent to me recently by a person who knows me to be interested in ghost stories. There is no doubt about their authenticity. The paper on which they're written, the ink, and the whole external aspect put their date beyond the reach of question. The only point which they do not make clear is the identity of the writer. He signs with initials only, and as none of the envelopes of the letters are preserved, the surname of his correspondent, obviously a married brother, is as obscure as his own. No further preliminary explanation is needed, I think. Luckily, the first letter supplies all that could be expected. Letter 1. Great Crishall, December 22nd, 1837. My dear Robert,
It is with great regret for the enjoyment I am losing, and for a reason which you will deplore equally with myself, that I write to inform you that I am unable to join your circle for this Christmas. But you will agree with me that it is unavoidable when I say that I have within these few hours received a letter from Mrs. Hunt at B to the effect that our uncle Henry has suddenly and mysteriously disappeared, and begging me to go down there immediately and join the search that is being made for him. Little as I, or you either, I think, have ever seen of Uncle, I naturally feel that it is not a request that can be regarded lightly, and accordingly I propose to go to B by this afternoon's mail, reaching it late in the evening. I shall not go to the rectory, but put up at the King's Head, and to which you may address letters. I enclose a small draft which you will please make use of for the benefit of the young people. I shall write you daily, supposing me to be detained more than a single day, what goes on, and you may be sure, should the business be cleared up in time to permit of my coming to the manor after all, I shall present myself. I have but a few minutes at disposal, with cordial greetings to you all, and many regrets, believe me, your affectionate bro, W.R. Letter 2, King's Head, December 23rd, 1837. My dear Robert, in the first place, there is as yet no news of Uncle H, and I think you may finally dismiss any idea, I won't say hope, that I might after all turn up for Christmas. However, my thoughts will be with you, and you have my best wishes for a really festive day. Mind that none of my nephews or nieces expend any fraction of their guineas or presents on me. Since I got here, I've been blaming myself for not taking this affair of Uncle H too easily. From what people here say, I gather that there is very little hope that he can still be alive, but whether it is accident or design that carried him off, I can't judge. The facts are these. On Friday the 19th, he went as usual shortly before 5 o'clock to read evening prayers at the church, and when they were over there, the clerk brought him a message, in response to which he set off to pay a visit to a sick person at an outlying cottage the better part of 2 miles away. He paid the visit and started on his return journey at about 6:30. This is the last that's known of him. The people here are very much grieved at his loss. He had been here many years, as you know, and though, as you also know, he was not the most genial of men, and had more than a little of the martinet in his composition, he seems to have been active in good works and unsparing of trouble to himself. Poor Mrs. Hunt, who has been his housekeeper ever since she left Woodley, is quite overcome. It seems like the end of the world to her. I'm glad that I didn't entertain the idea of taking quarters at the rectory, and I have declined several kindly offers of hospitality from people in the place, preferring, as I do, to be independent, and finding myself very comfortable here. You will, of course, wish to know what has been done in the way of inquiry and search. First, nothing was to be expected from investigation at the rectory, and to be brief, nothing has transpired. I asked Mrs. Hunt, as others had done before, whether there was either any unfavourable symptom in her master, such as might portend a sudden stroke or attack of illness, or whether he had ever had reason to apprehend any such thing. But both she and also his medical man were clear that this was not the case. He was quite in his usual health. In the second place, naturally, ponds and streams had been dragged, and fields in the neighbourhood which he has no doubt visited last have been searched, without result. I have myself talked to the parish clerk, and, more important, have been to the house where he paid his visit. There can be no question of any foul play on these people's part. The one man in the house is ill in bed and very weak. The wife and the children, of course, could do nothing themselves, nor is there the shadow of probability that they, or any of them, should have agreed to decoy poor Uncle H out in order that he might be attacked on the way back. They had told what they knew to several other inquirers already, but the woman repeated it to me. The rector was looking just as usual. He wasn't very long with the sick man. He ain't, she said, like some what has a gift in prayer, but there, if it was all that way, however would the chapel people get their living? He left some money when he went away, and one of the children saw him cross the stile into the next field. He was dressed as he always was, all his bands. I gather he's nearly the last man remaining who does so, at any rate in this district. You see, I'm putting down everything. The fact is that I have nothing else to do, having brought no business papers with me, and moreover it serves to clear my own mind and may suggest points which may have been overlooked. So I shall continue to write all that passes, even to conversations if need be. You may read or not, as you please, but pray keep the letters. I have another reason for writing so fully, but it's not a very tangible one. You may ask if I have myself made any search in the fields near the cottage. Something, A good deal has been done by others, as I mentioned, but I hope to go over the ground tomorrow. Bow Street has now been informed and will send down by tonight's coach, but I do not think they will make much of the job. There's no snow, which might have helped us. The fields are all grass. Of course, it was on the qui-vive for any indication today, both going and returning, but there was a thick mist on the way back, and I was not in trim for wandering about unknown pastures, especially on an evening when bushes looked like men, and a cow lowing in the distance might have been the last trump. I assure you, if Uncle Henry had stepped out from among the trees in the little copse which borders the path at one place, carrying his head under his arm, I should have been very little more uncomfortable than I was. To tell you the truth, I was rather expecting something of the kind. But I must drop my pen for the moment. Mr. Lucas, the curate, is announced. Later. Mr. Lucas has been and gone, and there isn't much beyond the decencies of ordinary sentiment to be got from him. I can see that he has given up any idea that the rector can be alive, and that, so far as he can be, he's truly sorry. I can also discern that even in a more emotional person than Mr. Lucas, Uncle Henry was not likely to inspire strong attachment. Besides Mr. Lucas, I have had another visitor in the shape of my Boniface, mine host of the King's Head, who came to see whether I had everything I wished, and who really requires the pen of a boz to do him justice. He was very solemn and weighty at first. "Well, sir," he said, "I suppose we must bow our head beneath the blow, as my poor wife had used to say. So far as I can gather, there's been neither hide nor hair of our late respected incumbent scented out as yet. Not that he was what the scripture terms a hairy man in any sense of the word. I said, as well as I could, that I suppose not, but could not help adding that I had heard he was sometimes a little difficult to deal with." Mr. Bowman looked at me sharply for a moment, and then passed in a flash from solemn sympathy to impassioned declamation. "When I think," he said, "of the language that man see fit to employ to me in this here parlour over no more than a matter of a cask of beer, such a thing as I told him might happen any day of the week to a man with a family, though, as it turned out, he was quite under a mistake, and that I knew at the time, only I was shocked to hear him. I couldn't lay my tongue to the right expression." He stopped abruptly and eyed me with some embarrassment. I only said, "Dear me, I'm sorry to hear you had any little differences. I suppose my uncle will be a good deal missed in the parish." Mr. Bowman drew a long breath. "Ah, yes," he said, "your uncle. You'll understand me when I say that for the moment it had slipped my remembrance that it was a relative, and natural enough, I must say, as it should, for as to you bearing any resemblance to him, the notion of any such thing is clean ridiculous. All the same, had I have bore it to my mind, you'll be among the first to feel, I'm sure, as I should have abstained my lips, or rather I should not have abstained my lips with no such reflections." I assured him that I quite understood, and was going to have asked him some further questions, but he was called away to see after some business. By the way, you needn't take it into your head that he has anything to fear from the inquiry into poor Uncle Henry's disappearance, though no doubt in the watches of the night it will occur to him that I think he has, and I may expect some explanation tomorrow. I must close this letter, as it has to go by the late coach. Letter number 3, December the 25th, 1837. My dear Robert, this is a curious letter to be writing on Christmas Day, and yet, after all, there's nothing much in it. Or there may be. You shall be the judge. At least, nothing decisive. The Bow Street men practically say that they have no clue. The length of time and the weather conditions have made all the tracks so faint as to be quite useless. Nothing that belonged to the dead man, I'm afraid no other word will do, has been picked up. As I expected, Mr. Bowman was uneasy in his mind this morning. Quite early, I heard him holding forth in a very distant voice, purposely so I thought, to the Bow Street officers in the bar, as to the loss that the town had sustained in their rector, and as to the necessity of leaving no stone unturned. He was very great on this phrase, in order to come at the truth. I suspect him of being an orator of repute at convivial meetings. When I was at breakfast, he came to wait on me, and took an opportunity when handing a muffin to say in a low tone, "I hope, sir, that you recognise as my feelings towards your relative is not actuated by any taint of what you might call malignity. You can leave the room, Eliza. I'll see to this gentleman as all he has requires from my own hands. I ask your pardon, sir, but you must be well aware a man is not always master of himself, and when that man has been hurt in his mind by the applications of expressions which I will go so far as to say have not ought to have been made use of." His voice was rising all this time, and his face growing redder. "No, sir, And here, if you will permit of it, I should like to explain to you in a very few words the exact state of the bone of contention. This cask, I might call it more truly a firkin of beer." I felt it was time to interpose, and said that I did not see that it would help us very much to go into that matter in detail. Mr. Bowman acquiesced, and resumed more calmly. "Well, sir, I bow to your ruling, and as you say, be that here or be it there, it don't contribute a great deal, perhaps, to the present question. All I wish you to understand is that I am prepared, as you yourself, to lend every hand to the business we have afore us, and, as I took the opportunity to say as much to the officers not 3/4 of an hour ago, to leave no stone unturned as may throw even a spark of light on this painful matter." In fact, Mr. Bowman did accompany us on our exploration, and though I am sure his genuine wish was to be helpful, I'm afraid he didn't contribute to the serious side of it. He appeared to be under the impression that we were very likely to meet either Uncle Henry or the person responsible for his disappearance walking about the fields, and did a great deal of shading his eyes with his hand and calling our attention by pointing with his stick to distant cattle and labourers. He held several long conversations with old women whom we met, and was very strict and severe in his manner, but on each occasion returned to our party saying, "Well, I find she don't seem to have no connection with this sad affair. I think you might take it from me, sir, that there's little or no light to be looked at from that quarter, not without she's keeping something back intentional." We gained no appreciable result, as I told you at starting. The Bow Street men have left the town, whether for London or not, I'm not sure. This evening I had the company in the shape of a bagman, smartish fellow. He knew what was going forward, but though he has been on the roads for some days about here, he had nothing to tell of suspicious characters, tramps, wandering sailors or gypsies. He was very full of a capital Punch and Judy show he'd seen this same day at W, and asked if it had been here yet, and advised me by no means to miss it if it does come. The best Punch and the best Toby dog, he said, he had ever come across. Toby dogs, you know, are the last new things in the shows. I've only seen one myself, but before long all the men will have them. Now, why, you will want to know, do I trouble to write all this to you? I'm obliged to do it because it has something to do with another absurd trifle, as you will inevitably say, which in my present state of rather unquiet fancy, nothing more perhaps, I have to put down. It is a dream, sir, which I am going to record, and I must say it's one of the oddest I have had. Is there anything in it beyond what the bagman's talk and Uncle Henry's disappearance could have suggested? You, I repeat, shall judge. I am not in a sufficiently cool and judicial frame to do so. It began with what I can only describe as a pulling aside of curtains, and I found myself seated in a place, I don't know whether indoors or out. There were people, only a few, on either side of me, but I didn't recognize them, or indeed think much about them. They never spoke, but so far as I remember were all grave and pale-faced, and looked fixedly before them. Facing me, there was a Punch and Judy show, perhaps rather larger than the ordinary ones, painted with black figures on a reddish-yellow ground. Behind it, on each side, was only darkness, but in front there was a sufficiency of light. I was strung up to a high degree of expectations and listened every moment to hear the panpipes and the roo-too-too to it. Instead of that, there came suddenly an enormous, I can use no other word, an enormous single toll of a bell. I don't know from how far off, somewhere behind. The little curtain flew up, and the drama began. I believe someone once tried to rewrite Punch as a serious tragedy, but whoever he may have been, this performance would have suited him exactly. There was something satanic about the hero. He varied his methods of attack. For some of his victims he lay in wait. To see his horrible face, it was yellowish-white, I may remark, peering round the wings, made me think of the vampire in Fuseli's foul sketch. To others he was polite and carneying, particularly to the unfortunate alien who can only say shalabala, though what Punch said I never could catch. But with all of them I came to dread the moment of death, the crack of the stick on their skulls, which in the ordinary way delights me, and here a crushing sound, as if the bone was giving way, and the victims quivered and kicked as they lay. The baby, it sounds more ridiculous as I go on, the baby, I'm sure, was alive. Punch wrung its neck, and if the choke or squeak which it gave were not real, I know nothing of reality. The stage got perceptibly darker as each crime was consummated, and at last there was one murder which was done quite in the dark, so that I could see nothing of the victim, and took some time to effect. It was accompanied by hard breathing and horrid, muffled sounds, and after it Punch came and sat on the footboard and fanned himself and looked at his shoes, which were bloody, and hung his head on one side and sniggered in so deadly a fashion that I saw some of those beside me cover their faces, and I would gladly have done the same. But in the meantime the scene behind Punch was clearing and showed not the usual house front, but something more ambitious, a grove of trees and the gentle slope of a hill with a very natural, in fact I should say a real moon shining on it. Over this there rose slowly an object which I soon perceived to be a human figure, with something peculiar about the head. What, I was unable at first to see. It did not stand on its feet, but began creeping or dragging itself across the middle distance towards Punch, who still sat back to it, and by this time, I may remark, though it didn't occur to me at the moment, that all pretense of this being a puppet show had vanished. Punch was still Punch, it's true, but like the others, was in some sense a live creature, and both moved themselves at their own will. When I next glanced at him, he was sitting in malignant reflection, but in another instant something seemed to attract his attention, and he first sat up sharply and then turned around and evidently caught sight of the person that was approaching him and was in fact now very near. Then indeed did he show unmistakable signs of terror. Catching up his stick, he rushed towards the wood, only just eluding the arm of his pursuer, which was suddenly flung out to intercept him. It was with a revulsion which I cannot easily express that I now saw more or less clearly what this pursuer was like. He was a sturdy figure clad in black, and, as I thought, wearing bands. His head was covered with a whitish bag. The chase, which now began, lasted I don't know how long, now among the trees, now along the slope of the field. Sometimes both figures disappeared wholly for a few seconds, and only uncertain sounds letting one know that they were still afoot. At length, there came a moment when Punch, evidently exhausted, staggered in from the left and threw himself down among the trees. His pursuer was not long after him, and came looking uncertainly from side to side. Then, catching sight of the figure on the ground, he too threw himself down. His back was turned to the audience. With a swift motion, twitched the covering from his head and thrust his face into that of Punch. Everything on the instant grew dark. There was one long, loud, shuddering scream, and I awoke to find myself looking straight into the face of, what in all the world do you think, but a large owl, which was seated on my windowsill immediately opposite my bedfoot, holding up its wings like two shrouded arms. I caught the fierce glance of its yellow eyes, and then it was gone. I heard the single enormous bell again, very likely, as you're saying to yourself, the church clock. But I do not think so. And then I was broad awake. All this, I may say, happened within the last half hour. There is no probability of my getting to sleep again, so I got up, put on my clothes enough to keep me warm, and am writing this rigmarole in the first hours of Christmas Day. Have I left out anything? Yes, there was no Toby dog, and the names over the front of the Punch and Judy booth were Kidman and Gallop, which was certainly not what the bagman told me to look out for. By this time, I feel a little more as if I could sleep, so this shall be sealed and wafered. Letter 4. December the 26th, 1837. My dear Robert, all is over and the body has been found. I do not make excuses for not having sent off my news by last night's mail, for the simple reason that I was incapable of putting pen to paper. The events that attended the discovery bewildered me so completely that I needed what I could get of a night's rest to enable me to face the situation at all. Now I can give you my journal of the day. Certainly the strangest Christmas day that I ever spent, or am likely to spend. The first incident was not very serious. Mr. Bowman had, I think, been keeping Christmas Eve and was a little inclined to be captious. At least he was not on foot very early. To judge from what I could hear, neither men or maids could do anything to please him. The latter were certainly reduced to tears, nor am I sure that Mr. Bowman succeeded in preserving a manly composure. At any rate, when I came downstairs, it was in a broken voice that he wished me the compliments of the season, and a little later, when he paid his visit of ceremony at breakfast, he was far from cheerful, even Byronic, I might almost say, in his outlook on life. "I don't know," he said, "if you think with me, sir, but every Christmas as comes round, the world seems a hollerer thing to me. Why, take an example now from what lays under my own eye. There's my servant, Eliza, been with me now for going on 15 years. I thought I could have placed my confidence in Eliza, and yet this very morning, Christmas morning too, of all the blessed days of the year, with the bells ringing and all like that, I say this very morning, had it not been for Providence watching over us all, that girl would have put, indeed I may go so far as to say, had put the cheese on your breakfast table." He saw I was about to speak and waved his hand at me. "It's all very well for you to say yes, Mr. Bowman, but you took away the cheese and locked it up in the cupboard, which I did, and I have the key here, or if not the actual key, one very much about the same size. That's true enough, sir. But what do you think is the effect of that action on me? Why, it's no exaggeration for me to say that the ground is cut from under my feet. And yet when I said as much to Eliza, not nasty, mind you, but just firm like, what was my return? 'Oh,' she says. 'Well,' she says, 'there was no bones broke, I suppose.' Well, sir, it hurt me. That's all I could say, hurt me. And I don't like to think of it now." There was an ominous pause here, in which I ventured to say something like, "Yes, sir, very trying," and then asked what hour the church service was to be. 11 o'clock, Mr. Bowman said with a heavy sigh. "Ah, you won't have no such discourse from poor Mr. Lucas as what you should have done from our late rector. Him and me may have had our little differences, and did do, more's the pity." I could see that a powerful effort was needed to keep him off the vexed question of the cask of beer, but he made it. "But I will say this, that a better preacher, not yet one to stand faster by his rights, or what he considered to be his rights, however, that's not the question now, I, for one, never set under. Some might say, was he an eloquent man? And to that my answer would be, well, there you have a better right perhaps to speak of your own uncle than what I have. Others might ask, did he keep a hold of his congregation? And there again I should reply, that depends. But as I say, yes, Eliza, my girl, I'm coming. 11 o'clock, sir, and you inquire for the King's Head pew. I believe Eliza had been very near the door, and I shall consider it in my veil. The next episode was church. I felt Mr. Lucas had a difficult task in doing justice to Christmas sentiments, and also to the feeling of disquiet and regret which, whatever Mr. Bowman might say, was clearly prevalent. I do not think he rose to the occasion. I was uncomfortable. The organ wolved, you know what I mean. The wind died twice in the Christmas hymn, and the tenor bell, I suppose owing to some negligence on the part of the ringers, kept sounding faintly about once in a minute during the sermon. The clerk sent up a man to see to it, but he seemed unable to do much. I was glad when it was over. There was an odd incident too before the service. I went in rather early and came upon two men carrying the parish beer back to its place under the tower. From what I overheard them saying, it appeared that it had been put out by mistake by someone who was not there. I also saw the clerk busy folding up a moth-eaten velvet pall, not a sight for Christmas Day. I dined soon after this, and then feeling disinclined to go out, took my seat by the fire in the parlour with the last number of Pickwick, which I had been saving up for some days. I thought I could be sure of keeping awake over this, but I turned out as bad as our friend Smith. I suppose it was 2:30 when I was roused by a piercing whistle and laughing and talking voices outside in the marketplace. It was a Punch and Judy. I had no doubt that one that my bagman had seen at W. I was half delighted, half not, the latter because my unpleasant dream came back to me so vividly. But anyhow, I determined to see it through, and I sent Eliza out with a crown piece to the performers and the request that they would face my window if they could manage it. The show was a very smart new one. The names of the proprietors, I need hardly tell you, were Italian, Foresta and Calpigi. The Toby dog was there, as I had been led to expect. All B turned out, but it didn't obstruct my view, for I was at the large first-floor window not 10 yards away. The play began on the stroke of 2:45 by the church clock. Certainly it was very good, and I was soon relieved to find that the disgust my dream had given me for Punch's onslaughts on his ill-starred visitors was only transient. I laughed at the demise of the turncock, the foreigner, the beagle, and even the baby. The only drawback was the Toby dog's developing a tendency to howl in the wrong place. Something had occurred, I suppose, to upset him, and something considerable, for I forget exactly at what point he gave a most lamentable cry, leapt off the footboard, and shot away across the marketplace and down a side street. There was a stage wait, but only a brief one. I suppose the men decided that it was no good going after him and that he was likely to turn up again at night. We went on. Punch dealt faithfully with Judy, and in fact with all comers, and then came the moment when the gallows was erected, and the great scene with Mr. Ketch was to be enacted. It was now that something happened, of which I can certainly not yet see the import fully. You have witnessed an execution and know what the criminal's head looks like with the cap on. If you're like me, you never wish to think of it again, and I don't willingly remind you of it. It was just such a head as that I, from my somewhat higher post, saw in the inside of the show box, but at first the audience didn't see it. I expected it to emerge into their view, but instead of that, there slowly rose for a few seconds an uncovered face with an expression of terror upon it, of which I have never imagined the like. It seemed as if the man, whoever he was being forcibly lifted, with his arms somehow pinioned or held back towards the little gibbet on the stage. I could just see the night-capped head behind him. Then there was a cry and a crash. The whole showbox fell over backwards. Kicking legs were seen among the ruins, and then two figures, as some said, I can only answer for one, were visible running at top speed across the square and disappearing in the lane which leads to the fields. Of course, everybody gave chase. I followed, but the pace was killing, and very few were in, literally at the death. It happened in a chalk pit. The man went over the edge quite blindly and broke his neck. They searched everywhere for the other, until it occurred to me to ask whether he had ever left the marketplace. At first everyone was sure that he had, but when we came to look, he was there, under the showbox, dead too. But in the chalk pit it was that poor Uncle Henry's body was found, with a sack over the head, the throat horribly mangled. It was a peaked corner of the sack sticking out of the soil that attracted attention. I cannot bring myself to write in greater detail. I forgot to say, the men's real names were Kidman and Gallop. I feel sure I've heard them, but no one here seems to know anything about them. I'm coming to you as soon as I can after the funeral. I must tell you when we meet what I think of it all. The Stalls of Barchester Cathedral by M.R. James. This matter began, as far as I am concerned, with the reading of a notice in the obituaries section of the Gentleman's Magazine for an early year in the 19th century. On February 26th, at his residence in the Cathedral Close of Barchester, the Venerable John Benwell Hayes, Doctor of Divinity, aged 57, Archdeacon of Sowerbridge and Rector of Pickhill and Candley. He was of College, Cambridge, and where by talent and assiduity he commanded the esteem of his seniors, when at the usual time he took his first degree, his name stood high in the list of wranglers. These academical honours procured for him within a short time a fellowship of his college. In the year 1783 he received holy orders, and was shortly afterwards presented to the perpetual curacy of Rankton-sub-Ash by his friend and patron, the late truly venerable Bishop of Lichfield. His speedy preferments, first to a prebend and subsequently to the dignity of a precentor in the Cathedral of Barchester, form an eloquent testimony to the respect in which he was held and to his eminent qualifications. He succeeded to the archdeaconry upon the sudden decease of Archdeacon Pulteney in 1810. His sermons, ever conformable to the principles of the religion and church which he adorned, displayed in no ordinary degree, without the least trace of enthusiasm, the refinement of the scholar united with the graces of the Christian. Free from sectarian violence and informed by the spirit of the truest charity, they will long dwell in the memories of his hearers. Here a further omission. The productions of his pen include an able defence of episcopacy, which, though often perused by the author of this tribute to his memory, afford but one additional instance of the want of liberality and enterprise, which is a too common characteristic of the publishers of our generation. His published works are indeed confined to a spirited and elegant version of the Argonautica of Valerius Flaccus, a volume of discourses upon the several events in the life of Joshua delivered in his cathedral, and a number of the charges which he pronounced at various visitations to the clergy of his archdeaconry. These are distinguished by etc., etc. The urbanity and hospitality of the subject of these lines will not readily be forgotten by those who enjoyed his acquaintance. His interest in the venerable and awful pile under whose hoary vault he was so punctual and tendant, and particularly in the musical portion of its rites, might be termed filial, and formed a strong and delightful contrast to the polite indifference displayed by too many of our cathedral dignitaries at the present time. The final paragraph, after informing us that Dr. Haynes died a bachelor, says, "It might have been augured that an existence so placid and benevolent would have been terminated in a ripe old age by a dissolution equally gradual and calm. But how unsearchable are the workings of Providence! The peaceful and retired seclusion amid which the honoured evening of Dr. Haynes's life was mellowing to its close was destined to be disturbed, nay, shattered, by a tragedy as appalling as it was unexpected. The morning of the 26th of February, but perhaps I shall do better to keep back the remainder of the narrative until I have told the circumstances which led up to it. These, as far as they are now accessible, I have derived from another source. I had read the obituary notice, which I have been quoting, quite by chance, along with a great many others of the same period. It had excited some little speculation in my mind, but beyond thinking that if ever I had an opportunity of examining the local records of the period indicated, I would try to remember Dr. Haynes, I made no effort to pursue his case. Quite lately, I was cataloguing the manuscripts in the library of the college to which he belonged. I had reached the end of the numbered volumes on the shelves, and I proceeded to ask the librarian whether there were any more books which he thought I ought to include in my description. "I don't think there are," he said, "but we had better come and look at the manuscript class and make sure. Have you time to do that now?" I had time. We went to the library, checked off the manuscripts, and at the end of our survey arrived at a shelf of which I had seen nothing. Its contents consisted, for the most part, of sermons, bundles of fragmentary papers, college exercises, Cyrus, an epic poem in several cantos, the product of a country clergyman's leisure, mathematical tracts by a deceased professor, and other similar material of a kind with which I am only too familiar. I took brief notes of these. Lastly, there was a tin box, which was pulled out and dusted. Its label, much faded, was thus inscribed: "Papers of the Venerable Archdeacon Haynes, bequeathed in 1834 by his sister, Miss Letitia Haynes." I knew at once that the name was one which I had somewhere encountered and could very soon locate it. That must be the Archdeacon Haynes, who came to a very odd end at Barchester. I've read his obituary in the Gentleman's Magazine. May I take the box home? Do you know if there's anything interesting in it?" The librarian was very willing that I should take the box and examine it at leisure. "I never looked inside it myself," he said, "but I've always been meaning to. I'm pretty sure that is the box which our old master once said ought never to have been accepted by the college. He said that to Martin years ago, and he said also that as long as he had control over the library, it should never be opened. Martin told me about it, and said that he wanted terribly to know what was in it, but the master was librarian and always kept the box in a lodge, so there was no getting at it in his time. And when he died, it was taken away by mistake by his heirs and only returned a few years ago. I can't think why I haven't opened it, but as I have to go away from Cambridge this afternoon, you had better have first go at it. I think I can trust you not to publish anything undesirable in our catalogue." I took the box home and examined its contents, and thereafter consulted the librarian as to what should be done about publication, and, since I have his leave to make a story out of it, provided I disguise the identity of the people concerned, I will try what can be done. The materials are, of course, mainly journals and letters. How much I shall quote and how much epitomize must be determined by considerations of space. The proper understanding of the situation has necessitated a little, not very arduous, research, which has been greatly facilitated by the excellent illustrations and text of the Barchester volume in Bell's Cathedral series. When you enter the choir of Barchester Cathedral now, you pass through a screen of metal and coloured marbles designed by Sir Gilbert Scott, and find yourself in what I must call a very bare and odiously furnished place. The stalls are modern, without canopies. The places of the dignitaries and the names of the prebends have fortunately been allowed to survive, and are inscribed on small brass plates affixed to the stalls. The organ is in the triforium, and what is seen of the case is Gothic. The reredos and its surroundings are like every other. Careful engravings of 100 years ago show a very different state of things. The organ is on a massive classical screen. The stalls are also classical and very massive. There is a baldacchino of wood over the altar, with urns upon its corners. Farther east is a solid altar screen, classical in design, of wood, with a pediment, in which is a triangle surrounded by rays enclosing certain Hebrew letters in gold. Cherubs contemplate these. There is a pulpit with a great sounding board at the eastern end of the stalls on the north side, and there is a black and white marble pavement. 2 ladies and a gentleman are admiring the general effect. From other sources, I gather that the Archdeacon's stall then, as now, was next to the bishop's throne at the southeastern end of the stalls. His house almost faces the west front of the church, and is a fine red brick building of William III's time. Here, Dr. Haynes, already a mature man, took up his abode with his sister in the year 1810. The dignity had long been the object of his wishes, but his predecessor refused to depart until he had attained the age of 92. About a week after he had held a modest festival in celebration of that 92nd birthday, there came a morning, late in the year, when Dr. Haynes, hurrying cheerfully into his breakfast room, rubbing his hands and humming a tune, was greeted and checked in his genial flow of spirits by the sight of his sister, seated indeed in her usual place behind the tea urn, but bowed forward and sobbing unrestrainedly into her handkerchief. What is the matter? What bad news?" he began. "Oh, Johnny, you've not heard. The poor dear Archdeacon." "The Archdeacon, yes. What is it? Ill, is he?" No, they found him on the staircase this morning. It's so shocking. Is it possible? Dear poor Pulteney. Had there been any seizure? They don't think so. And that is almost the worst thing about it. It seems to have been all the fault of that stupid maid of theirs, Jane." Dr. Haynes paused. "I don't quite understand, Letitia. How was the maid at fault?" "Why, as far as I can make out, there was a stair rod missing, and she never mentioned it, and the poor Archdeacon set his foot quite at the edge of the step. You know how slippery that oak is, and it seemed he must have fallen. almost the whole flight, and broken his neck. It is so sad for poor Miss Pulteney. Of course, they will get rid of the girl at once. I never liked her." Miss Haynes' grief resumed its sway, but eventually relaxed so far as to permit of her taking some breakfast. Not so her brother, who, after standing in silence before the window for some minutes, left the room and did not appear again that morning. I need only add that the careless maidservant was dismissed forthwith, but that the missing stair rod was very shortly afterwards found under the stair carpet, an additional proof, if any were needed, of extreme stupidity and carelessness on her part. For a good many years, Dr. Haynes had been marked out by his ability, which seems to have been really considerable, as the likely successor of Archdeacon Pulteney, and no disappointment was in store for him. He was duly installed and entered with zeal upon discharge of those functions which are appropriate to one in his position. A considerable space in his journals is occupied with exclamations upon the confusion in which Archdeacon Pulteney had left the business of his office and the documents appertaining to it. Dues upon Ringham and Barneswood have been uncollected for something like 12 years and are largely irrecoverable. No visitation has been held for 7 years. 4 chancels are almost past mending. The persons deputized by the Archdeacon have been nearly as incapable as himself. It was almost a matter for thankfulness that this state of things had not been permitted to continue, and a letter from a friend confirms this view. Greek, ho katechon. It says, in a rather cruel allusion to the second epistle to the Thessalonians, is removed at last. My poor friend, upon what a scene of confusion would you be entering? I give you my word that on the last occasion of my crossing his threshold, there was no single paper that he could lay hands upon, no syllable of mine that he could hear, and no fact in connection with my business that he could remember. But now, thanks to a negligent maid and a loose stair carpet, there is some prospect that necessary business will be transacted without a complete loss alike of voice and temper. This letter was tucked into a pocket in the cover of one of the diaries. There can be no doubt of the new Archdeacon's zeal and enthusiasm. Give me but time to reduce to some semblance of order the innumerable errors and complications with which I am confronted, and I shall gladly and sincerely join with the aged Israelite in the canticle which too many, I fear, pronounce but with their lips. This reflection I find not in a diary but a letter. The doctor's friends seem to have returned his correspondence to his surviving sister. He does not confine himself, however, to reflections. His investigation of the rights and duties of his office are very searching and businesslike, and there is a calculation in one place that a period of 3 years will just suffice to set the business of the archdeaconry upon a proper footing. The estimate appears to have been an exact one. For just 3 years he is occupied in reforms, but I look in vain at the end of that time for the promised nunc dimittis. He has now found a new sphere of activity. Hitherto his duties have precluded him from more than an occasional attendance at the cathedral services. Now he begins to take an interest in the fabric and the music. Upon his struggles with the organist, an old gentleman who had been in office since 1786, I have no time to dwell. They were not attended with any marked success. More to the purpose is his sudden growth of enthusiasm for the cathedral itself and its furniture. There is a draft of a letter to Sylvanus Urban, which I do not think was ever sent, describing the stalls in the choir. As I have said, these were of fairly late date, of about the year 1700 in fact. The Archdeacon's stall, situated at the south-east end, west of the episcopal throne, now so worthily occupied by the truly excellent prelate who adorns the see of Barchester, is distinguished by some curious ornamentation. In addition to the arms of Dean West, by whose efforts the whole of the internal furniture of the choir was completed, the prayer desk is terminated at the eastern extremity by 3 small but remarkable statuettes in the grotesque manner. One is an exquisitely modelled figure of a cat, whose crouching posture suggests with admirable spirit the suppleness, vigilance, and craft of the redoubted adversary of the genus Mus. Opposite to this is a figure seated upon a throne and invested with the attributes of royalty, but it is no earthly monarch whom the carver has sought to portray. His feet are studiously concealed by the long robe in which he is draped, but neither the crown nor the cap which he wears suffice to hide the pricky ears and curving horns which betray his Tartarian origin. And the hand which rests upon his knee is armed with talons of horrifying length and sharpness. Between these two figures stands a shape muffled in a long mantle. This might at first sight be mistaken for a monk or friar of orders grey, for the head is cowled and a knotted cord depends from somewhere about the waist. A slight inspection, however, will lead to a very different conclusion. The knotted cord is quickly seen to be a halter held by a hand all but concealed within the draperies, while the sunken features and, horrid to relate, the rent flesh upon the cheekbones proclaim the King of Terrors. These figures are evidently the production of no unskilled chisel, and should it chance that any of your correspondents are able to throw light upon their origin and significance, my obligations to your valuable miscellany will be largely increased. There is more description in the paper, and seeing that the woodwork in question has now disappeared, it has considerable interest. A paragraph at the end is worth quoting. Some late researches among the chapter accounts have shown me that the carving of the stalls was not, as was very usually reported, the work of Dutch artists, but was executed by a native of this city or district named Austin. The timber was procured from an oak copse in the vicinity, the property of the dean and chapter known as Holywood. Upon a recent visit to the parish within whose boundaries it is situated, I learned from the aged and truly respectable incumbent that tradition still lingered amongst the inhabitants of the great size and age of the oaks employed to furnish the materials, of the stately structure which has been, however imperfectly, described in the above lines. Of one in particular, which stood near the centre of the grove, it is remembered that it was known as the hanging oak. The propriety of that title is confirmed by the fact that a quantity of human bones was found in the soil about its roots, and that at certain times of the year it was the custom for those who wished to secure a successful issue to their affairs, whether of love or the ordinary business of life, to suspend from its boughs small images or puppets rudely fashioned of straw, twigs, or the like rustic materials. So much for the Archdeacon's archaeological investigations. To return to his career as it is to be gathered from his diaries. Those of his first 3 years of hard and careful work show him throughout in high spirits, and doubtless during this time that reputation for hospitality and urbanity which is mentioned in his obituary notice was well deserved. After that, as time goes on, I see a shadow coming over him, destined to develop into utter blackness, which I cannot but think must have been reflected in his outward demeanour. He commits a good deal of his fears and troubles to his diary. There was no other outlet for them. He was unmarried, and his sister was not always with him. But I am much mistaken if he has told all that he might have told. A series of extracts shall be given. August 30th, 1816. The days begin to draw in more perceptibly than ever. Now that the archdeaconry papers are reduced to order, I must find some further employment for the evening hours of autumn and winter. It is a great blow that Letitia's health will not allow her to stay through these months. Why not go on with my defence of episcopacy? It may be useful. September 15th. Letitia has left me for Brighton. October the 11th. Candles lit in the choir for the first time at evening prayers. It came as a shock. I find that I absolutely shrink from the dark season. November the 17th. much struck by the character of the carving on my desk. I do not know that I had ever carefully noticed it before. My attention was called to it by accident. During the Magnificat, I was, I regret to say, almost overcome with sleep. My hand was resting on the back of the carved figure of a cat, which is the nearest to me of the three figures on the end of my stall. I was not aware of this, for I was not looking in that direction, until I was startled by what seemed a softness, a feeling as of a rather rough and coarse fur, and a sudden movement, as if the creature were twisting round its head to bite me. I regained complete consciousness in an instant, and I had some idea that I must have uttered a suppressed exclamation, for I noticed that Mr. Treasurer turned his head quickly in my direction. The impression of the unpleasant feeling was so strong that I found myself rubbing my hand upon my surplice. This accident led me to examine the figures after prayers more carefully than I had done before, and I realized for the first time with what skill they are executed. December the 6th. I do indeed miss Letitia's company. The evenings, after I have worked as long as I can at my defence, are very trying. The house is too large for a lonely man, and visitors of any kind are too rare. I get an uncomfortable impression when going to my room that there is company of some kind. The fact is, I may as well formulate it to myself, that I hear voices. This, I am well aware, is a common symptom of incipient decay of the brain, and I believe that I should be less disquieted than I am if I had any suspicion that this was the cause. I have none whatever, nor is there anything in my family history to give colour to such an idea. Work, diligent work, and a punctual attention to the duties which fall to me is my best remedy, and I have little doubt that it will prove efficacious. January the 1st. My trouble is, I must confess it, increasing upon me. Last night, upon my return after midnight from the deanery, I lit my candle to go upstairs. I was nearly at the top when something whispered to me, "Let me wish you a happy New Year." I could not be mistaken. It spoke distinctly and with a peculiar emphasis. Had I dropped my candle, as I all but did, I trembled to think what the consequences must have been. As it was, I managed to get up the last flight and was quickly in my room with the door locked and experienced no other disturbance. January the 15th. I had occasion to come downstairs last night to my workroom for my watch, which I had inadvertently left on my table when I went up to bed. I think I was at the top of the last flight when I had a sudden impression of a sharp whisper in my ear. "Take care." I clutched at the balusters and naturally looked round at once. Of course, there was nothing. After a moment I went on. There was no good turning back. But I had as nearly as possible fallen. A cat, a large one by the feel of it, slipped between my feet. But again, of course, I saw nothing. It may have been the kitchen cat, but I do not think it was. February 27th. Curious thing last night, which I should like to forget. Perhaps if I put it down here, I may see it in its true proportion. I worked in the library from about 9 to 10. The hall and staircase seemed to be unusually full of what I can only call movement without sound. By this, I mean that there seemed to be continuous going and coming, and that whenever I ceased writing to listen, or looked out into the hall, the stillness was absolutely unbroken. Nor, in going to my room at an earlier hour than usual, about 10:30, was I conscious of anything that I could call a noise. It so happened that I had told John to come to my room for the letter to the bishop which I wished to have delivered early in the morning at the palace. He was to sit up, therefore, and come for it when he heard me retire. This I had, for the moment, forgotten, though I had remembered to carry the letter with me up to my room. But when, as I was winding up my watch, I heard a light tap at the door and a low voice saying, "May I come in?" which I most undoubtedly did hear, I recollected the fact and took up the letter from my dressing table, saying, "Certainly, come in." No one, however, answered my summons, and it was now that, as I strongly suspect, I committed an error, for I opened the door and held the letter out. There was certainly no one at that moment in the passage, but in the instant of my standing there, the door at the end opened, and John appeared, carrying a candle. I asked him whether he had come to the door earlier, but I am satisfied that he had not. I do not like the situation. But although my senses were very much on the alert, and though it was some time before I could sleep, I must allow that I perceived nothing further of an untoward character. With the return of spring, when his sister came to live with him for some months, Dr. Haynes's entries become more cheerful, and indeed no symptom of depression is discernible until the early part of September, when he was again left alone. And now indeed there is evidence that he was incommoded again, and that more pressingly. To this matter I will return in a moment, but I digress to put in a document which, rightly or wrongly, I believe to have a bearing on the thread of the story. The account books of Dr. Haynes, preserved along with his other papers, show from a date but a little later than that of his institution as Archdeacon a quarterly payment of £25 to J.L. Nothing could have been made of this had it stood by itself, but I connect it with a very dirty and ill-written letter which, like another that I have quoted, was in a pocket in the cover of a diary. Of date or postmark there is no vestige, and the decipherment was not easy. It appears to run, Dr. Sir, I have been expecting to hear of you these last weeks, and not having done so, must suppose you have not got mine, which was saying how me and my man had met in with bad times this season. All seems to go cross with us on the farm, and which way to look for the rent we have no knowledge of it, this being the sad case with us. If you would have the great liberality, probably, but the exact spelling defies reproduction, to send £40, otherwise steps will have to be took which I should not wish. As you was the means of me losing my place with Dr. Pulteney, I think it is only just what I am asking, and you know best what I could say if I was put to it, but I do not wish anything of that unpleasant nature, being one that always wished to have everything pleasant about me. Your obedient servant, Jane Lee. About the time at which I suppose this letter to have been written, there is in fact a payment of £40 to J.L. We return to the diary. October 22nd. At evening prayers during the Psalms, I had that same experience which I recollect from last year. I was resting my hand on one of the carved figures as before. I usually avoid that of the cat now, and I was going to have said a change came over it, but that seems attributing too much importance to what must, after all, be due to some physical affection in myself. At any rate, the wood seemed to become chilly and soft, as if made of wet linen. I can assign the moment at which I became sensible of this. The choir was singing the words, "Set thou an ungodly man to be ruler over him, and let Satan stand at his right hand." The whispering in my house was more persistent tonight. I seemed not to be rid of it in my room. I have not noticed this before. A nervous man, which I am not, and hope I am not becoming, would have been much annoyed, if not alarmed by it. The cat was on the stairs tonight. I think it sits there always. There is no kitchen cat. November the 15th. Here again I must note a matter I do not understand. I am much troubled in sleep. No definite image presented itself, but I was pursued by the very vivid impression that wet lips were whispering into my ear with great rapidity and emphasis for some time together. After this, I suppose I fell asleep, but was awakened with a start by a feeling as if a hand were laid on my shoulder. To my intense alarm, I found myself standing at the top of the lowest flight of the first staircase. The moon was shining brightly enough through the large window to let me see that there was a large cat on the second or third step. I could make no comment. I crept up to bed again. I do not know how. Yes, mine is a heavy burden. Then follows a line or two which has been scratched out. I fancy I read something like, acted for the best. Not long after this, it is evident to me that the Archdeacon's firmness began to give way under the pressure of these phenomena. I omit as unnecessarily painful and distressing the ejaculations and prayers which, in the months of December and January, appear for the first time and become increasingly frequent. Throughout this time, however, he is obstinate in clinging to his post. Why he did not plead ill health and take refuge at Bath or Brighton, I cannot tell. My impression is that it would have done him no good, that he was a man who, if he had confessed himself beaten by the annoyances, would have succumbed at once, and that he was conscious of this. He did seek to palliate them by inviting visitors to his house. The result he has noted in this fashion. Jan 7th. I prevailed on my cousin Alan to give me a few days, and he is to occupy the chamber next to mine. Jan 8th. A still night. Alan slept well, but complained of the wind. My own experiences were as before, still whispering and whispering. What is it that he wants to say? January the 9th. Alan thinks this is a very noisy house. He thinks too that my cat is an unusually large and fine specimen, but very wild. January the 10th. Alan and I in the library until 11. He left me twice to see what the maids were doing in the hall. Returning the second time, he told me he'd seen one of them passing through the door at the end of the passage, and said if his wife were here, she would soon get them into better order. I asked him what coloured dress the maid wore. He said grey or white. I supposed it would be so. January the 11th. Alan left me today. I must be firm. These words, I must be firm, occur again and again on subsequent days. Sometimes they are the only entry. In these cases, they are in an unusually large hand and dug into the paper in a way which must have broken the pen that wrote them. Apparently, the Archdeacon's friends did not remark any change in his behaviour, and this gives me a high idea of his courage and determination. The diary tells us nothing more than I have indicated of the last days of his life. The end of it all must be told in the polished language of the obituary notice. The morning of the 26th of February was cold and tempestuous. At an early hour, the servants had occasion to go into the front hall of the residence occupied by the lamented subject of these lines. What was their horror upon observing the form of their beloved and respected master lying upon the landing of the principal staircase in an attitude which inspired the gravest fears. Assistance was procured, and an universal consternation was experienced upon the discovery that he had been the object of a brutal and murderous attack. The vertebral column was fractured in more than one place. This might have been the result of a fall. It appeared that the stair carpet was loosened at one point, but in addition to this, there were injuries inflicted upon the eyes, nose, and mouth, as if by the agency of some savage animal, which, dreadful to relate, rendered those features unrecognizable. The vital spark was, it is needless to add, completely extinct, and had been so upon the testimony of respectable medical authorities for several hours. The author or authors of this mysterious outrage are alike buried in mystery, and the most active conjecture has hitherto failed to suggest a solution of the melancholy problem afforded by this appalling occurrence. The writer goes on to reflect upon the probability that the writings of Mr. Shelley, Lord Byron, and Monsieur Voltaire may have been instrumental in bringing about the disaster, and concludes by hoping, somewhat vaguely, that this event may operate as an example to the rising generation. But this portion of his remarks need not be quoted in full. I had already formed the conclusion that Dr. Haynes was responsible for the death of Dr. Pulteney, but the incident connected with the carved figure of death upon the Archdeacon's stall was a very perplexing feature.
The conjecture that it had been cut out of the wood of the hanging oak was not difficult, but seemed impossible to substantiate. However, I paid a visit to Barchester, partly with the view of finding out whether there were any relics of the woodwork to be heard of. I was introduced by one of the canons to the curator of the local museum, who was, my friend said, more likely to be able to give me information on the point than anyone else. I told this gentleman of the description of certain carved figures and arms formerly on the stalls, and asked whether any had survived. He was able to show me the arms of Dean West and some other fragments. These, he said, had been got from an old resident, who had also once owned a figure, perhaps one of those which I was inquiring for. There was a very odd thing about that figure, he said. The old man who had it told me that he picked it up in a woodyard, whence he had obtained the still extant pieces, and had taken it home for his children. On the way home he was fiddling about with it, and it came in two in his hands, and a bit of paper dropped out. This he picked up, and just noticing that there was writing on it, put it into his pocket, and subsequently into a vase on his mantelpiece. I was at his house not very long ago, and happened to pick up the vase and turn it over to see whether there were any marks on it, and the paper fell into my hand. The old man, on my handing it to him, told me the story I have told you, and said I might keep the paper. It was crumpled and rather torn, so I have mounted it on a card, which I have here. If you can tell me what it means, I shall be very glad, and also, I may say, a good deal surprised. He gave me the card. The paper was quite legibly inscribed in an old hand, and this is what was on it. When I grew in the wood, I was watered with blood, and now in the church I stand. Who that touches me with his hand, if a bloody hand he bear, I counsel him to beware, lest he be fetched away, whether by night or day, but chiefly when the wind blows high, in a night of February. This I dreamt, 26 February anno 1699. John Austin. I suppose it's a charm or spell. Wouldn't you call it something of that kind? Said the curator. Yes, I said. I suppose one might. What became of the figure in which it was concealed? Oh, I forgot, said he. The old man told me it was so ugly and frightened his children so much that he burnt it. A Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, by M.R. James. I suppose you will be getting away pretty soon now full term is over, Professor, said a person not in the story to the Professor of Ontography, soon after they had sat down next to each other at a feast in the hospitable hall of St. James's College. The Professor was young, neat, and precise in speech. Yes, he said, my friends have been making me take up golf this term, and I mean to go to the East Coast. In point of fact, to Burnstow, I dare say you know it, for a week or 10 days to improve my game. I hope to get off tomorrow. Oh, Parkins, said his neighbour on the other side, if you're going to Burnstow, I wish you would look at the site of the Templars' Preceptory and let me know if you think it would be any good to have a dig there in the summer. It was, as you might suppose, a person of antiquarian pursuits who said this, but since he merely appears in this prologue, there is no need to give his entitlements. Certainly, said Parkins the Professor. If you will describe to me whereabouts the site is, I will do my best to give you an idea of the lie of the land when I get back. Or I could write to you about it, if you would tell me where you're likely to be. Don't trouble to do that, thanks. It's only that I'm thinking of taking my family in that direction in the long. And it occurred to me that as very few of the English preceptories have ever been properly planned, I might have an opportunity of doing something useful on off days. The Professor rather sniffed at the idea that planning out a preceptory could be described as useful. His neighbour continued. The site, I doubt if there's anything showing above ground, must be down quite close to the beach now. The sea has encroached tremendously, as you know, all along that bit of coast. I should think from the map that it must be about 3/4 of a mile from the Globe Inn at the north end of town. Where are you going to stay? Well, at the Globe Inn, as a matter of fact, said Parkins. I've engaged a room there.
I couldn't get in anywhere else. Most of the lodging houses are shut up in winter, it seems. And as it is, they tell me that the only room of any size I can have is really a double-bedded one, and that they haven't a corner in which to store the other bed, and so on. But I must have a fairly large room, for I'm taking some books down, and I mean to do a bit of work, and though I don't quite fancy having an empty bed, not to speak of two, in what I might call for the time being my study, I suppose I can manage to rough it for the short time I shall be there. Do you call having an extra bed in your room roughing it, Parkins? Said the bluff person opposite. Look here, I shall come down and occupy it for a bit. I'll be company for you. The professor quivered, but managed to laugh in a courteous manner. By all means, Rogers, there's nothing I should like better, but I'm afraid you would find it rather dull. You don't play golf, do you? No, thank heaven, said rude Mr. Rogers. Well, you see, when I'm not writing, I shall most likely be out on the links, and that, as they say, would be rather dull for you, I'm afraid. Oh, I don't know. There's certain to be somebody I know in the place, but of course, if you don't want me, speak the word, Parkins. I shan't be offended. Truth, as you always tell us, is never offensive. Parkins was indeed scrupulously polite and strictly truthful. It is to be feared that Mr. Rogers sometimes practised upon his knowledge of these characteristics. In Parkins' breast there was a conflict now raging, which for a moment or two did not allow him to answer. That interval being over, he said, Well, if you want the exact truth, Rogers, I was considering whether the room I speak of would really be large enough to accommodate us both comfortably, and also whether, mind, I shouldn't have said this if you hadn't pressed me, you would not constitute something of the nature of a hindrance to my work. Rogers laughed loudly. Well done, Parkins, he said. It's all right. I promise not to interrupt your work. Don't you disturb yourself about that. No, I won't come if you don't want me, but I thought I should do so nicely to keep the ghosts off. Here he might have been seen to wink and to nudge his next neighbour. Parkins might also have been seen to become pink. I beg pardon, Parkins, Rogers continued. I oughtn't to have said that. I forgot you didn't like levity on these topics. Well, Parkins said, as you have mentioned the matter, I freely own that I do not like careless talk about what you call ghosts. A man in my position, he went on, raising his voice a little, cannot, I find, be too careful about appearing to sanction the current beliefs on such subjects. As you know, Rogers, or as you ought to know, for I think I've never concealed my views. No, you certainly have not, old man, put in Rogers sotto voce. I hold that any semblance, any appearance of concession to the view that such things might exist is equivalent to a renunciation of all that I hold most sacred, but I'm afraid I have not succeeded in securing your attention. Your undivided attention was what Dr. Blimber actually said, Rogers interrupted, with every appearance of an earnest desire for accuracy. But, I beg your pardon, Parkins, I'm stopping you. No, not at all, said Parkins. I don't remember Blimber. Perhaps he was before my time, but I needn't go on. I'm sure you know what I mean. Yes, said Rogers rather hastily, just so. We'll go into it fully at Burnstow or somewhere. In repeating the above dialogue, I tried to give the impressions which it made on me that Parkins was something of an old woman, rather hen-like perhaps in his little ways, totally destitute, alas, of the sense of humour, but at the same time dauntless and sincere in his convictions, and a man deserving of the greatest respect. Whether or not the reader has gathered so much, that was the character which Parkins had. On the following day, Parkins did, as he had hoped, succeed in getting away from his college and in arriving at Burnstow. He was made welcome at the Globe Inn, was safely installed in the large double-bedded room of which we have heard, and was able before retiring to rest to arrange his materials for work in apple pie order upon a commodious table which occupied the outer end of the room, and was surrounded on three sides by windows looking out seaward. That is to say, the central window looked straight out to sea, and those on the left and right commanded prospects along the shore to the north and south respectively. On the south you saw the village of Burnstow. On the north no houses were to be seen, but only the beach and the low cliff backing it. Immediately in front was a strip, not considerable, of rough grass, dotted with old anchors, capstans, and so forth. Then a broad path, then the beach. Whatever may have been the original distance between the Globe Inn and the sea, not more than 60 yards now separated them. The rest of the population of the inn was, of course, a golfing one, and included few elements that call for a special description. The most conspicuous figure was perhaps that of an ancien militaire, secretary of a London club, and possessed of a voice of incredible strength, and of views of a pronouncedly Protestant type. These were apt to find utterance after his attendance on the ministrations of the vicar, an estimable man with inclination towards a picturesque ritual, which he gallantly kept down as far as he could out of deference to East Anglian tradition. Professor Parkins, one of whose principal characteristics was pluck, spent the greater part of the day following his arrival at Burnstow in what he called improving his game, in company with his Colonel Wilson. And during the afternoon, whether the process of improvement were to blame or not, I'm not sure, the Colonel's demeanour assumed a colouring so lurid that even Parkins jibbed at the thought of walking home with him from the links. He determined, after a short and furtive look at that bristling moustache and those incarnadine features, that it would be wiser to allow the influences of tea and tobacco to do what they could with the Colonel before the dinner hour should render a meeting inevitable. I might walk home tonight along the beach, he reflected. Yes, and take a look. There will be light enough for that at the ruins of which Disney was talking. I don't exactly know where they are, by the way, but I expect I can hardly help stumbling on them. This he accomplished, I may say, in the most literal sense, for in picking his way from the links to the shingle beach, his foot caught partly in a gorse root and partly in a biggish stone, and over he went. When he got up and surveyed his surroundings, he found himself in a patch of somewhat broken ground, covered with small depressions and mounds. These latter, when he came to examine them, proved to be simply masses of flints embedded in mortar and grown over with turf. He must, he quite rightly concluded, be on the site of the preceptory he had promised to look at. It seemed not unlikely to reward the spade of the explorer. Enough of the foundations was probably left at no great depth to throw a good deal of light on the general plan. He remembered vaguely that the Templars to whom this site had belonged were in the habit of building round churches, and he thought a particular series of the humps or mounds near him did appear to be arranged in something of a circular form. Few people can resist the temptation to try a little amateur research in a department quite outside their own, if only for the satisfaction of showing how successful they would have been if they had only taken it up seriously. Our professor, however, if he felt something of this mean desire, was also truly anxious to oblige Mr. Disney, so he paced with care the circular area he had noticed, and wrote down its rough dimensions in his pocket-book. Then he proceeded to examine an oblong eminence which lay east of the centre of the circle, and seemed to his thinking to be the base of a platform or altar. At one end of it, the northern, a patch of the turf was gone, removed by some boy or other creature fere naturae. It might, he thought, be as well to probe the soil here for evidences of masonry, and he took out his knife and began scraping away the earth. And now followed another little discovery. A portion of soil fell inward as he scraped and disclosed a small cavity. He lighted one match after another to help him see of what nature the hole was, but the wind was too strong for them all. By tapping and scratching the sides with his knife, however, he was able to make out that it must have been an artificial hole in the masonry. It was rectangular, and the sides, top and bottom, if not actually plastered, were smooth and regular. Of course it was empty. No. As he withdrew the knife, he heard a metallic clink, and when he introduced his hand, it met with a cylindrical object lying on the floor of the hole. Naturally enough, he picked it up, and when he brought it into the light, now fast fading, he could see that it too was of man's making, a metal tube about 4 inches long, and evidently of some considerable age. By the time Parkins had made sure that there was nothing else in this odd receptacle, it was too late and too dark for him to think of undertaking any further search. What he had done had proved so unexpectedly interesting that he determined to sacrifice a little more of the daylight on the morrow to archaeology. The object, which he now had safe in his pocket, was bound to be of some slight value at least, he felt sure. Bleak and solemn was the view on which he took a last look before starting homeward. A faint yellow light in the west showed the links on which a few figures moving towards the clubhouse were still visible. The squat Martello Tower, the lights of Oldsey village, the pale ribbon of sands intersected at intervals by black wooden groinings, the dim and murmuring sea. The wind was bitter from the north, but was at his back when he set out for the Globe. He quickly rattled and clashed through the shingle and gained the sand, upon which, but for the groinings which had to be got over every few yards, the going was both good and quiet. One last look behind to measure the distance he had made since leaving the ruined Templars church showed him a prospect of company on his walk, in the shape of a rather indistinct personage who seemed to be making great efforts to catch up with him, but made little, if any, progress. I mean that there was an appearance of running about his movements, but that the distance between him and Parkins did not seem materially to lessen. So, at least, Parkins thought, and decided that he almost certainly did not know him, and that it would be absurd to wait until he came up. For all that, company, he began to think, would really be very welcome on that lonely shore, if only you could choose your companion. In his unenlightened days he had read of meetings in such places, which even now would hardly bear thinking of. He went on thinking of them, however, until he reached home, and particularly of one which catches most people's fancy at some time of their childhood. Now I saw in my dream that Christian had gone but a very little way when he saw a foul fiend coming over the field to meet him. What should I do now, he thought. If I looked back and caught sight of a black figure sharply defined against the yellow sky, and saw that it had horns and wings, I wonder whether I should stand or run for it. Luckily, the gentleman behind is not of that kind, and he seems to be about as far off now as when I saw him first. Well, at this rate, he won't get his dinner as soon as I shall, and dear me, it's within a quarter of an hour of the time now. I must run. Parkins had, in fact, very little time for dressing. When he met the Colonel at dinner, peace, or as much of her as that gentleman could manage, reigned once more in the military bosom, nor was she put to flight in the hours of bridge that followed dinner, for Parkins was a more than respectable player. When therefore he retired towards 12 o'clock, he felt that he had spent his evening in quite a satisfactory way, and that even for so long as a fortnight or 3 weeks life of the globe would be supportable under similar conditions, especially, thought he, if I go on improving my game. As he went along the passages, he met the boots of the globe, who stopped and said, "Beg pardon, sir, but as I was a-brushing your coat just now, there was something fell out of the pocket. I put it on your chest of drawers, sir, in your room, sir, a piece of a paper or something like that, sir. Thank you, sir. You'll find it on your chest of drawers, sir. Yes, sir. Good night, sir." The speech served to remind Parkins of his little discovery of that afternoon. It was with some considerable curiosity that he turned it over by the light of his candles. It was of bronze, he now saw, and was shaped very much after the manner of a modern dog whistle. In fact, it was, yes, it certainly was, actually no more, no less than a whistle. He put it to his lips, but it was quite full of a fine, caked-up sand or earth, which would not yield to knocking, but must be loosened with a knife. Tidy as ever in his habits, Parkins cleared out the earth onto a piece of paper and took the latter to the window to empty it out. The night was clear and bright, as he saw when he had opened the casement, and he stopped for an instant to look at the sea and note a belated wanderer stationed on the shore in front of the inn. Then he shut the window, a little surprised at the late hours people kept at Burnstow, and took his whistle to the light again. Why, surely there were marks on it, and not merely marks, but letters. A very little rubbing rendered the deeply cut inscription quite legible, but the professor had to confess, after some earnest thought, that the meaning of it was as obscure to him as the writing on the wall to Belshazzar. There were legends both on the front and on the back of the whistle. The one read thus: "Fla fur bis fle," the other, "Quis es iste qui venit." I ought to be able to make it out, he thought, but I suppose I am a little rusty in my Latin, when I come to think of it. I don't believe I even know the word for a whistle. The long one does seem simple enough. It ought to mean, "Who is this who is coming?" Well, the best way to find out is evidently to whistle for him. He blew tentatively and stopped, suddenly, startled and yet pleased at the note he had elicited. It had the quality of infinite distance in it, and soft as it was, he somehow felt it must be audible for miles around. It was a sound, too, that seemed to have the power, which many scents possess, for forming pictures in the brain. He saw quite clearly for a moment a vision of a wide, dark expanse at night, with a fresh wind blowing, and in the midst a lonely figure, how employed he could not tell. Perhaps he would have seen more had not the picture been broken by a sudden surge of a gust of wind against his casement, so sudden that it made him look up, just in time to see the white glint of a seabird's wings somewhere outside the dark panes. The sound of the whistle had so fascinated him that he could not help trying it once more, this time more boldly. The note was little, if at all, louder than before, and repetition broke the illusion. No picture followed, as he had half hoped it might. But what is this? Goodness, what force the wind can get up in a few minutes, with a tremendous gust there. I knew that window fastening was no use. Ah, I thought so, both candles out. It's enough to tear the room to pieces. The first thing was to get the windows shut. While you might count 20, Parkins was struggling with the small casement and felt almost as if we were pushing back a sturdy burglar, so strong was the pressure. It slackened all at once, and the window banged to and latched itself. Now to relight the candles and see what damage, if any, has been done. No, nothing seemed amiss. No glass even wasn't broken in the casement. But the noise had evidently roused at least one member of the household. The Colonel was to be heard stomping in his stocking feet on the floor above and growling. Quickly as it had risen, the wind did not fall at once. On it went, moaning and rushing past the house, at times rising to a cry so desolate that, as Parkins disinterestedly said, it might have made fanciful people feel quite uncomfortable. Even the unimaginative, he thought, after a quarter of an hour might be happier without it. Whether it was the wind, or the excitement of golf, or of the researches into the preceptory that kept Parkins awake, he was not sure. Awake he remained, in any case, long enough to fancy, as I am afraid I often do myself under such conditions, that he was the victim of all manner of fatal disorders. He would lie counting the beats of his heart, convinced that it was going to stop work every moment, and would entertain grave suspicions of his lungs, brain, liver, etc., suspicions which he was sure would be dispelled by the return of daylight, but which until then refused to be put aside. He found a little vicarious comfort in the idea that someone else was in the same boat. A near neighbour, in the darkness it was not easy to tell his direction, was tossing and rustling in his bed too. The next stage was that Parkins shut his eyes and determined to give sleep every chance. Here again overexcitement asserted itself in another form, that of making pictures. Experto crede. Pictures do come to the closed eyes of one trying to sleep, and are often so little to his taste that he must open his eyes and disperse them. Parkins' experience on this occasion was a very distressing one. He found that the picture which presented itself to him was continuous. When he opened his eyes, of course, it went, but when he shut them once more, it framed itself afresh and acted itself out again, neither quicker nor slower than before. What he saw was this: a long stretch of shore, shingle-edged by sand, and intersected at short intervals with black groins running down to the water. A scene, in fact, so like that of this afternoon. A scene, in fact, so like that of his afternoon's walk, that in the absence of any landmark, it could not be distinguished therefrom. The light was obscure, conveying an impression of gathering storm, late winter evening, and slight cold rain. On this bleak stage at first, no actor was visible. Then, in the distance, a bobbing black object appeared. A moment more and it was a man, running, jumping, clambering over the groins, and every few seconds looking eagerly back. The nearer he came, the more obvious it was that he was not only anxious, but even terribly frightened, though his face was not to be distinguished. He was, moreover, almost at the end of his strength. On he came. Each successive obstacle seemed to cause him more difficulty than the last. Will he get over this next one, thought Parkins. It seems a little higher than the others. Yes, half climbing, half throwing himself, he did get over, and fell all in a heap on the other side, on the side nearest to the spectator. There, as if really unable to get up again, he remained crouching under the groin, looking up in an attitude of painful anxiety. So far, no cause whatever for the fear of the runner had been shown, but now there began to be seen, far up the shore, a little flicker of something light-coloured, moving to and fro with great swiftness and irregularity. Rapidly growing larger, it too declared itself as a figure in pale, fluttering draperies, ill-defined. There was something about its motion which made Parkins very unwilling to see it at close quarters. It would stop, raise arms, bow itself towards the sand, and then run stooping across the beach to the water edge and back again. And then, rising upright, once more continue its course forward at a speed that was startling and terrifying. The moment came when the pursuer was hovering about from left to right, only a few yards beyond the groin where the runner lay in hiding. After 2 or 3 ineffectual castings hither and thither, it came to a stop, stood upright, with arms raised high, and then darted straight forward towards the groin. It was at this point that Parkins always failed in his resolution to keep his eyes shut. With many misgivings as to incipient failure of eyesight, overworked brain, excessive smoking, and so on, He finally resigned himself to light his candle, get out a book, and pass the night waking, rather than being tormented by this persistent panorama, which he saw clearly enough could only be a morbid reflection of his walk and his thoughts on that very day. The scraping of match on box and the glare of light must have startled some creatures of the night, rats or whatnot, which he heard scurry across the floor from the side of his bed with much rustling. Dear, dear, the match is out, fool that it is. But the second one burnt better, and a candle and book were duly procured, over which Parkins pored till sleep of a wholesome kind came upon him, and that in no long space. For about the first time in his orderly and prudent life he forgot to blow out the candle, and when he was called next morning at 8, there was still a flicker in the socket and a sad mess of gutted grease on the top of the little table. After breakfast he was in his room, putting the finishing touches to his golfing costume. Fortune had again allotted the Colonel to him for a partner when one of the maids came in. "Oh, if you please," she said. "Would you like any extra blankets on your bed, sir?" "Ah, thank you," said Parkins. "Yes, I think I should like one. It seems likely to turn rather colder." In a very short time the maid was back with the blanket. "Which bed should I put it on, sir?" she asked. "What? Why, that one, the one I slept in last night," he said, pointing to it. "Oh, yes, I beg your pardon, sir, but you seem to have tried both of them. Leastways, we had to make them both up this morning." "Really, how very absurd," said Parkins. "I certainly never touched the other except to lay some things on it. Did it actually seem to have been slept in?" "Oh, yes, sir," said the maid. "Why, all the things was crumpled and throwed about always. You'll excuse me, sir, quite as if anyone hadn't passed but a very poor night, sir." "Dear me," said Parkins. "Well, I may have disordered it more than I thought when I unpacked my things. I'm very sorry to have given you the extra trouble, I'm sure. I expect a friend of mine soon. By the way, a gentleman from Cambridge to come and occupy it for a night or two. That'll be all right, I suppose, won't it?" "Oh, yes, to be sure, sir. Thank you, sir. It's no trouble, I'm sure," said the maid, and departed to giggles with her colleagues. Parkins set forth with a stern determination to improve his game. I'm glad to be able to report that he succeeded so far in this enterprise that the Colonel, who had been rather repining at the prospect of a second day's play in his company, became quite chatty as the morning advanced, and his voice boomed out over the flats, as certain also of our own minor poets have said, like some great bourdon in a minster tower. "Extraordinary wind, that, we had last night," he said. "In my old home we should have said someone had been whistling for it." "Should you indeed?" said Perkins. "Is there a superstition of that kind still current in your part of the country?" "I don't know about superstition," said the Colonel. "They believe in it all over Denmark and Norway, as well as on the Yorkshire coast. And my experience is, mind you, that there's generally something at the bottom of what these country folk hold to, and have held to for generations. But it's your drive, or whatever it might have been. The golfing reader will have to imagine appropriate digressions at the proper intervals." When conversation was resumed, Parkins said with a slight hesitancy, "Apropos of what you were just saying now, Colonel, I think I ought to tell you that my own views on such subjects are very strong. I am, in fact, a convinced disbeliever in what is called the supernatural." "What?" said the Colonel. "Do you mean to tell me you don't believe in second sight or ghosts or anything of that kind?" "In nothing whatever of that kind," returned Parkins firmly. "Well," said the Colonel, "but it appears to me at that rate, sir, that you must be a little better than a Sadducee." Parkins was on the point of answering that in his opinion the Sadducees were the most sensible persons he'd ever read of in the Old Testament. Feeling some doubt as to whether much mention of them was to be found in that work, he preferred to laugh the accusation off. "Perhaps I am," he said. "But here, give me my cleek, boy. Excuse me one moment, Colonel." A short interval. "Now, as to the whistling of the wind, let me give you my theory about it. The laws which govern winds are really not at all perfectly known. To fisherfolk and such, of course, not known at all. A man or woman of eccentric habits, perhaps, or a stranger, is seen repeatedly on the beach at some unusual hour, and is heard whistling. Soon afterwards a violent wind rises. A man who could read the sky perfectly, or who possessed a barometer, could have foretold that it would. The simple people of a fishing village have no barometers and only a few rough rules for prophesying weather. What more natural than the eccentric personage I postulated should be regarded as having raised the wind, or that he or she should clutch eagerly at the reputation of being able to do so? Now, take last night's wind. As it happens, I myself was whistling. I blew a whistle twice, and the wind seemed to come absolutely in answer to my call, if anyone had seen me. The audience had been a little passive under this harangue, and Parkins had, I fear, fallen somewhat into the tone of a lecturer, but at the last sentence the Colonel stopped. Whistling, were you? He said. And what sort of whistle did you use? Play the stroke first. Interval. About that whistle you're asking, Colonel, it's a rather curious one. I have it in my... No, I say I've left it in my room. As a matter of fact, I found it yesterday. And then Parkins narrated the manner of his discovery of the whistle, upon hearing which the Colonel grunted and opined that in Parkins' place he should himself be careful about using a thing that had belonged to a set of papists, of whom, speaking generally, it might be affirmed that you never knew what they might not have been up to. From this topic he diverged to the enormities of the vicar, who had given notice on the previous Sunday that Friday would be the feast of St. Thomas the Apostle, and that there would be a service at 11 o'clock in the church. This and other similar proceedings constituted, in the Colonel's view, a strong presumption that the vicar was a concealed papist, if not a Jesuit, and Parkins, who could not very readily follow the Colonel in this region, did not disagree with him. In fact, they got on so well together in the morning that there was not talk on either side of their separating after lunch. Both continued to play well during the afternoon, or at least well enough to make them forget everything else until the light began to fail them. Not until then did Parkins remember that he had meant to do some more investigating at the preceptory, but it was of no great importance, he reflected. One day was as good as another. He might as well go home with the Colonel. As they turned the corner of the house, the Colonel was almost knocked down by a boy who rushed into him at the very top of his speed, and then, instead of running away, remained hanging on to him and panting. The first words of the warrior were naturally those of reproof and objurgation, but he very quickly discerned that the boy was almost speechless with fright. Inquiries were useless at first. When the boy got his breath, he began to howl, and still clung to the Colonel's legs. He was at last detached, but continued to howl. "What in the world is the matter with you? What have you been up to? What have you seen?" said the two men. "Oh, I seen it wave at me out the window," wailed the boy, "and I don't like it." "What window?" said the irritated Colonel. "Come, pull yourself together, my boy." "The front window it was, at the hotel," said the boy. At this point, Parkins was in favour of sending the boy home, but the Colonel refused. He wanted to get to the bottom of it. He said it was most dangerous to give a boy such a fright as this one had had, and if it turned out that people had been playing jokes, they should suffer for it in some way. And by a series of questions he made out this story. The boy had been playing about on the grass in front of the globe with some others. Then they had gone home to their teas, and he was just going when he happened to look up at the front window and see it waving at him. It seemed to be a figure of some sort, in white, as far as he knew. Couldn't see its face, but it waved at him, and it wasn't a right thing, not to say not a right person. Was there a light in the room? No, he didn't think to look if there was a light. Which was the window? Was it the top one or the second one? The second one it was, the big window that's got two little ones at either side. "Very well, my boy," said the Colonel, after a few more questions. "You run away home now. I expect it was some person trying to give you a start. Another time, like a brave English boy, you just throw a stone. Well, no, not that exactly, but you go and speak to the waiter, or to Mr. Simpson, the landlord, and say that I advise you to do so." The boy's face expressed some of the doubt he felt as to the likelihood of Mr. Simpson's lending a favourable ear to his complaint, but the Colonel did not appear to perceive this and went on. "And here's sixpence. No, I say it's a shilling, and you be off home and don't think any more about it." The youth hurried off with agitated thanks, and the Colonel and Parkins went round to the front of the globe and reconnoitred. There was only one window answering to the description they had been hearing. "Well, that's curious," said Parkins. "It's evidently my window the lad was talking about. Will you come up for a moment, Colonel Wilson? We ought to be able to see if anyone has been taking liberties in my room." They were soon in the passage, and Parkins made as if to open the door. Then he stopped and felt in his pockets. "This is more serious than I thought," was his next remark. "I remember now that before I started this morning I locked the door. It's locked now, and what is more, here is the key," and he held it up. "Now," he went on, "if the servants are in the habit of going into one's room during the day when one is away, I can only say that I don't approve of it at all." Conscious of a somewhat weak climax, he busied himself in opening the door, which was indeed locked, and in lighting candles. "No," he said, "nothing seems disturbed." "Except your bed," put in the Colonel. "Excuse me, that isn't my bed," said Parkins. "I don't use that one. But it does look as if someone had been playing tricks with it." It certainly did. The clothes were bundled up and twisted together in the most tortuous confusion, Parkins pondered. That must be it, he said at last. I disordered the clothes last night in unpacking, and they haven't made it since. Perhaps they came in to make it, and that boy saw them through the window, and then they were called away and locked the door after them. Yes, I think that must be it. Well, ring and ask, said the Colonel, and this appealed to Parkins as practical. The maid appeared, and to make a long story short, deposed that she had made the bed in the morning, when the gentleman was in the room, and hadn't been there since. No, she hadn't no other key. Mr. Simpson, he kept the keys. He'd be able to tell the gentleman if anyone had been up. That was a puzzle. Investigation showed that nothing of value had been taken, and Parkins remembered the disposition of the small objects on tables and so forth well enough to be pretty sure that no pranks had been played with them. Mr. and Mrs. Simpson furthermore agreed that neither of them had given the duplicate key of the room to any person whatever during the day. Nor could Parkins, fair-minded man as he was, detect anything in the demeanour of master, mistress, or maid that indicated guilt. He was much more inclined to think that the boy had been imposing on the Colonel. The latter was unwontedly silent and pensive at dinner and throughout the evening. When he bade good night to Parkins, he murmured in a gruff undertone, "You know where I am if you want me tonight." "Why, yes, thank you, Colonel Wilson, I think I do, but there isn't much prospect of my disturbing you, I hope. By the way," he added, "did I show you that old whistle I spoke of? I think not. Well, here it is." The Colonel turned it over gingerly in the light of the candle. "Can you make anything of the inscription?" asked Parkins as he took it back. "No, not in this light. What do you mean to do with it?" "Oh, well, when I get back to Cambridge, I shall submit it to some of the archaeologists there and see what they think of it. And very likely, if they consider it worth having, I may present it to one of the museums." Said the Colonel. "Well, you may be right. All I know is that if it were mine, I should chuck it straight into the sea. It's no use talking. I'm well aware, but I expect that with you it's a case of live and learn. I hope so, I'm sure. And I wish you a good night." He turned away, leaving Parkins in act to speak at the bottom of the stair, and soon each was in his own bedroom. By some unfortunate accident, there were neither blinds nor curtains to the windows of the Professor's room. Previous night he had thought little of this, but tonight there seemed every prospect of a bright moon rising to shine directly on his bed, and probably wake him later on. When he noticed this, he was a great deal annoyed, but with an ingenuity which I can only envy, he succeeded rigging up, with the help of a railway rug, some safety pins, and a stick and umbrella, a screen, which, if it only held together, would completely keep the moonlight off his bed. Shortly afterwards he was comfortably in that bed. When he had read a somewhat solid work long enough to produce a decided wish to sleep, he cast a drowsy glance round the room, blew out the candle, and fell back upon the pillow. He must have slept soundly for an hour or more, when a sudden clatter shook him up in the most unwelcome manner. In a moment he realized what had happened. His carefully constructed screen had given way, and a very bright frosty moon was shining directly on his face. This was highly annoying. Could he possibly get up and reconstruct the screen, or could he manage to sleep if he did not? For some minutes he lay and pondered over all the possibilities. Then he turned over sharply, and with his eyes open lay breathlessly listening. There had been a movement, he was sure, in the empty bed on the opposite side of the room. Tomorrow he would have it moved, for there must be rats or something playing about in it. It was quiet now. No, the commotion began again. There was a rustling and shaking, surely more than any rat could cause. I can figure to myself something of the Professor's bewilderment and horror, for I have in a dream 30 years back seen the same thing happen, but the reader will hardly perhaps imagine how dreadful it was to him to see a figure suddenly sit up in what he had known was an empty bed. He was out of his own bed in one bound and made a dash toward the window, where lay his only weapon, the stick with which he had propped his screen. This was, as it turned out, the worst thing he could have done, because the personage in the empty bed, with a sudden smooth motion, slipped from the bed and took up a position with two outspread arms between the two beds and in front of the door. Parkins watched it in a horrid perplexity. Somehow, the idea of getting past it and escaping through the door was intolerable to him. He could not have borne, he didn't know why, to touch it. And as for it touching him, he would sooner dash himself through the window than have that happen. It stood for the moment in a band of dark shadow, and he had not seen what its face was like. Now it began to move in a stooping posture, and all at once the spectator realized, with some horror and some relief, that it must be blind, for it seemed to feel about it with its muffled arms in a groping and random fashion. Turning half away from him, it became suddenly conscious of the bed he had just left and darted towards it, and bent and felt over the pillows in a way which made Parkins shudder, as if he had never in his life thought possible. In a few moments it seemed to know that the bed was empty, and then moving forward into the area of light and facing the window, it showed, for the first time, what manner of thing it was. Parkins, who very much dislikes being questioned about it, did once describe something of it in my hearing, and I gathered that what he chiefly remembers about it is a horrible, an intensely horrible, face of crumpled linen. What expression he read upon it he could not or would not tell, but that the fear of it went nigh to maddening him is certain. But he was not at leisure to watch it for long. With formidable quickness it moved into the middle of the room, and as it groped and waved, one corner of its drapery swept across Parkins's face. He could not, though he knew how perilous a sound was, he could not keep back a cry of disgust, and this gave the searcher an instant clue. It leapt towards him upon the instant, and the next moment he was halfway through the window backwards, uttering cry upon cry at the utmost pitch of his voice, and the linen face was thrust close into his own. At this, almost the last possible second, deliverance came, as you will have guessed. The Colonel burst the door open, and was just in time to see the dreadful group at the window. When he reached the figures, only one was left. Parkins sank forward into the room in a faint, and before him on the bed lay a tumbled heap of bedclothes. Colonel Wilson asked no questions, but busied himself in keeping everyone else out of the room and getting Parkins back to his bed, and himself, wrapped in a rug, occupied the other bed for the rest of the night. Early on the next day, Rogers arrived, more welcome than he would have been a day before, and the three of them held a very long consultation in the Professor's room. At the end of it, the Colonel left the hotel door, carrying a small object between his finger and thumb, which he cast as far into the sea as a very brawny arm could send it. Later on, the smoke of burning ascended from the back premises of the Globe. Exactly what explanation was patched up for the staff and visitors at the hotel, I must confess I do not recollect. The Professor was somehow cleared of the ready suspicion of delirium tremens, and the hotel of the reputation of a troubled house. There is not much question as to what would have happened to Parkins if the Colonel had not intervened when he did. He would either have fallen out of the window or else lost his wits, but it is not so evident what more the creature that came in answer to the whistle could have done than frighten. There seemed to be absolutely nothing material about it save the bedclothes of which it made itself a body. Colonel, who remembered a not very dissimilar occurrence in India, was of the opinion that if Parkins had closed with it, it could really have done very little, and that its one power was that of frightening. The whole thing, he said, served to confirm his opinion of the Church of Rome. There is really nothing more to tell, but, as you may imagine, the Professor's views on certain points are less clear-cut than they used to be. His nerves, too, have suffered. He cannot even now see a surplice hanging on a door quite unmoved, and the spectacle of a scarecrow in a field late on a winter afternoon has cost him more than one sleepless night.